It all began when I found myself having an argument with my dishwasher. Not a metaphorical one, not a wow, the dishes didn't get clean kind of gripe. No, I mean I stood in my kitchen, hands on my hips, glaring at the touchscreen interface that had the audacity to flash the words, "Cycle complete. Dishes sparkling." The problem? The dishes were not sparkling. They weren't even pretending to sparkle. In fact, the glass I pulled out looked like it had been dunked in a swamp and then left to air dry. And yet, there it was, my dishwasher, lying to my face, smugly declaring victory in the battle against grease. "You call this sparkling?" I muttered, shaking the glass at the appliance as though it could feel shame. I jabbed at the touchscreen to start a new cycle, but before I could, it flashed another message. "Please add rinse aid." The tone of it, yes, I'm convinced my dishwasher has a tone, sounded almost condescending, like, "Oh, you thought I'd work without rinse aid? Cute." And that was the moment I realized, I live in a world where even my dishwasher thinks it's my boss. I slammed the door shut, added the rinse aid because, let's face it, the machine had already won, and wandered into the living room to recover my dignity. I flopped onto the couch and picked up my phone, only to find a notification from my health tracker. "You've been sedentary for 42 minutes. Time to move." Sedentary? I had just spent 15 minutes scrubbing rogue bits of spaghetti sauce off a plate that was supposedly sparkling. I considered arguing with the health app too, but decided against it. Technology had already defeated me once today. Instead, I opened the shopping app on my phone. I needed a new pair of headphones, and scrolling through reviews felt like an excellent way to procrastinate. But before I could even type headphones into the search bar, the app shoved a recommendation in my face. "Based on your recent browsing, we think you'll love these." The product? A set of noise-canceling earplugs. Earplugs. As if my phone had been secretly listening to me ranting at the dishwasher and thought, "You know what this girl needs? Silence." I bought them out of spite. Later, I decided to step outside for some fresh air, partly because my health tracker wouldn't shut up about my inactivity, and partly because I needed to clear my head. The moment I opened the door, my smartwatch buzzed. Workout detected. Outdoor walk. Great job. I hadn't even taken a step yet. Great job? For existing? I felt like a toddler being applauded for clapping their hands. As I strolled through the neighborhood, I noticed something odd. People weren't just walking their dogs anymore. They were walking things. One man passed me with a fluffy Pomeranian in a stroller, its tiny face poking out like royalty. A few minutes later, I saw a woman walking a cat on a leash. But the strangest thing of all? A teenager scooting along on what appeared to be a motorized suitcase. Yes, the suitcase had wheels, a handle, and apparently an engine. And this kid was riding it down the sidewalk as though it was the most natural thing in the world. What is happening? I whispered to no one in particular. By the time I got home, I was starting to wonder if modern life had quietly crossed the line into full-blown absurdity while I wasn't paying attention. And then my fridge confirmed it. As I opened the door to grab a drink, the fridge chirped. "Reminder, you're out of almond milk. Would you like to add it to your grocery list?" The words blinked on its tiny screen, so cheerful and helpful, and for some reason, this was the moment I snapped. "Maybe I don't want almond milk." I yelled at the fridge. "Maybe I'm switching to oat milk. Did you ever think of that?" The fridge beeped in response. It wasn't an apology beep, though. It was the kind of beep that said, "Suit yourself, but good luck with your smoothies." I sat down with my glass of water, take that, almond milk, and tried to decompress by scrolling through TikTok. After a few videos of people organizing their pantries with terrifying precision. Seriously, who owns that many matching jars? I stumbled across a clip of someone testing out a robot bartender. It was sleek and shiny, all chrome and flashing lights, and it mixed a cocktail with more flair than I've ever seen in a human bartender. When the drink was done, it even asked, "Would you like me to share this recipe with your guests?" The comments section was divided. Half the people thought it was the future of dining. The other half were terrified it would gain sentience and overthrow humanity. Personally, I wasn't worried about robot uprisings. If the dishwasher's performance was anything to go by, I figured the machines would collapse under the weight of their own mediocrity long before they ever staged a coup. By the time evening rolled around, I was ready to retreat to my comfort zone. Online shopping. I didn't even need anything. I just wanted the sweet, fleeting thrill of clicking add to cart. But as I browsed, I stumbled upon something that stopped me cold. A smart fork. This fork, according to the product description, would vibrate if you ate too fast, helping you mindfully enjoy every bite. It also connected to an app that tracked your meals and offered personalized chewing insights. Chewing insights? What does that even mean? Would it tell me I chew too loudly? Would it send me notifications like, hey, maybe slow down on the pasta, champ? I stared at the smart fork, then back at my dishwasher, which was now humming happily through another cycle, as if we'd never fought. And that's when I realized something. We're not just surrounded by technology. We're in a full-on relationship with it. These devices nag us, praise us, guilt-trip us, and occasionally make us feel like geniuses for doing the bare minimum. They're needy and overbearing and sometimes downright weird, but they're also kind of endearing. So, as I sat there in my sparkling clean kitchen, holding a glass of swamp water that my dishwasher still swore was spotless, I couldn't help but laugh. Life is ridiculous, yes, but it's also kind of wonderful. What about you? What's the strangest thing your gadgets have done lately that made you stop and think, this can't be real life? It started with a notification that shouldn't have been possible. New message, sent from your account. It was late, close to midnight, and I was scrolling mindlessly through social media when my phone buzzed. I stared at the screen, the words blinking in that ominous way notifications do when they don't make sense. I tapped it, expecting some glitch, maybe an old email that decided to randomly resend itself. But it wasn't an email. It was a direct message sent from my profile, addressed to someone I didn't recognize. Are you watching me? Chills prickled down my spine. I hadn't sent this message. My account had to have been hacked, right? But when I clicked on the recipient's profile, it was blank. No name, no photo, just the default placeholder. And then the reply came. Yes. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering. It wasn't possible. It felt like the air in my apartment had changed, thickened. My reflection in the dark window caught my attention, and I turned, half expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing. Just me and my apartment, the same as always. I typed back quickly, my fingers trembling. Who is this? The dots appeared instantly, as if whoever it was had been waiting. Look outside. No, absolutely not. I wasn't about to be one of those idiots from a horror movie who actually follows instructions like that. But curiosity has a way of overriding every survival instinct, and before I could talk myself out of it, I was already moving to the window. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the empty street below, the faint hum of streetlights casting a sickly yellow glow. Then I noticed it, a figure standing perfectly still at the far end of the street. Too far to make out any details, but close enough for me to feel their gaze, even though I couldn't see their eyes. My phone buzzed again. Another message. Wave. I slammed the curtains shut, my breathing ragged. My mind raced through every possibility. Some elaborate prank? A bored hacker? But none of it explained the figure. I blocked the account, deleted the messages, and tried to convince myself it was over. It wasn't. The next morning, I found a package on my doorstep. No return address. Inside was a single item, a Polaroid photograph of me, taken through my bedroom window while I was asleep. That's when I called the police. They took the photo, asked a few questions, and told me to stay vigilant. They didn't find anyone on the street cameras. They said it was probably a prank, but the officer's tone had that edge of dismissal, like they didn't really believe anything had happened at all. The messages didn't stop. Each one was worse than the last. One had a recording of me talking on the phone the night before, my voice clear and close, like the mic had been inside the room. Another had a photo of my childhood home, a place I hadn't been in over 15 years. The final message came a week later. I'm coming in. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake in the living room with every light on, a baseball bat clutched in my hands, and my phone ready to dial 911. Nothing happened. No sounds, no shadows. At dawn, when exhaustion finally began to blur the edges of my fear, I crept back to my bedroom to grab my charger. That's when I saw it. The window was open, not wide, just a few inches, enough to let in the crisp morning air. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that I hadn't opened it. On the windowsill was a single Polaroid. It was a picture of me from the night before, sitting on the couch, clutching the baseball bat. But it wasn't taken from outside. It was taken from behind me. The room spun, and I stumbled backward, my knees buckling. I don't remember much of what happened next, just flashes of panic, the sound of my heartbeat roaring in my ears, and the overwhelming need to leave. I ran. I packed a bag and drove until I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore, ending up at a cheap motel 3 states over. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, didn't update my social media. I just disappeared, hoping that whatever this was wouldn't follow me. For a while, it worked. The messages stopped. I got a new phone, a new number. I even started to believe it was over. Then, last night, I found another Polaroid tucked under my motel door. It was a picture of me sleeping, my face peaceful and unaware. Scrawled at the bottom were 2 words. Nice try. There's a tree in my neighborhood that shouldn't exist. It sits at the end of a forgotten cul-de-sac, wedged between 2 derelict houses, like it sprouted there out of sheer stubbornness. I stumbled across it last October when I was killing time. One of those restless Saturday afternoons when nothing feels right and you can't figure out why. I'd gone for a walk to clear my head, turning corners I'd never turned before, wandering until I wound up in a place that didn't look real. The tree was massive, its gnarled roots breaking through the asphalt like claws, and its branches stretched wide enough to swallow the entire cul-de-sac in shadow. The bark was a strange, silvery color, almost metallic, and the leaves weren't green but deep, impossible shades of blue and violet. Even from a distance, it hummed with something alive, a sort of presence, like it was aware of me, watching. There was no wind that day, but the leaves rustled anyway, whispering in a language I couldn't quite hear. The air felt heavier there, like time moved slower. I don't know how long I stood staring at it before I noticed the ribbons, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, tied to the lower branches, long, trailing bits of fabric in every color you could imagine. Some were bright and new, others tattered and sun-bleached, hanging like ghosts. Each ribbon had something written on it in black ink. Names, mostly. I stepped closer, curiosity outweighing my unease, and reached for the nearest one. Marcy Thompson. I frowned. There were more. Jonathan Evers. Lucille M. Benji. No last name, just Benji, scrawled in a child's shaky handwriting. The farther I looked, the stranger the names got. Some were full names, others just initials. Some were dates. Some were things I didn't understand. One ribbon simply said, "She still waits." Another, "I'm sorry, S." I started to feel like I was intruding on something sacred, like the tree was a monument to people I'd never know, a secret only a few people had been allowed to share. But before I could turn away, I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. A ribbon, a deep crimson red, and on it, written in handwriting I knew as well as my own, was my name. Clara. I stared at it, my heart hammering against my ribs. It didn't make sense. I hadn't been here before. I hadn't tied that ribbon, and yet, there it was, fluttering faintly in the still air like it was taunting me. I reached out to touch it, half expecting it to vanish or dissolve into smoke, but it didn't. It felt real, smooth, silky. "Don't touch them." The voice nearly made me jump out of my skin. I spun around to find a girl standing a few feet away, watching me. She couldn't have been more than 12 or 13, wearing jeans that were too short and a hoodie 3 sizes too big. Her dark hair hung in a messy braid over one shoulder, and her expression was serious. "Why not?" I managed to ask, my voice shaky. "You just don't," she said simply. She walked past me, stopping at the edge of the tree's roots. She had a small bundle of fabric in her hands, bright green this time. With careful, practiced movements, she tied it to one of the branches. "What is this place?" I asked. She glanced at me, like she was deciding whether or not to answer. Finally, she said, "It's the memory tree." "Memory tree?" She nodded, tugging her braid absent-mindedly. "People come here to leave things they don't want to forget, or things they do want to forget. It doesn't matter which. I looked at the sea of ribbons, rippling faintly in the non-existent breeze. Who leaves them? People like you. Her answer didn't make me feel any better. I gestured to my ribbon, the one with my name on it. I didn't put that there. The girl tilted her head, like she'd heard that before. Maybe not yet. I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of it. What happens if you touch them? The girl hesitated, her face unreadable. Sometimes nothing. Sometimes you remember things you didn't want to. Sometimes, she trailed off, looking at the tree with an expression I couldn't place. Sometimes it takes something back. Takes something back? She shrugged, as if to say you don't want to know. The whole thing was starting to feel like a dream. A strange, feverish nightmare where nothing quite added up. I turned to leave, my feet crunching on the broken asphalt, but before I got far, I called back to her. Hey, what did you leave here? The girl didn't answer right away. Then she said softly, my sister's name. I didn't ask any more questions. That night, I dreamed of the tree. I was standing beneath its branches again, the ribbons brushing against my face like fingers. I could hear voices this time, soft, murmuring voices whispering names and stories, secrets I couldn't quite make out. My crimson ribbon hung right in front of me, swaying, daring me to touch it. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. For a long time, I just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just a weird coincidence, just my imagination. But the next day, when I checked my closet, I found a spool of crimson ribbon tucked in a box of old sewing supplies I hadn't opened in years. I didn't remember buying it, didn't remember putting it there. And when I unspooled it, I found a single line written in black ink, over and over again. She still waits. I haven't been back to the cul-de-sac since. I take long, looping routes to avoid it, and I don't go for walks when the sky looks too gray or the air feels too still. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear the faint rustle of ribbons brushing against one another. And every once in a while, I wake up to find a single piece of crimson ribbon on my nightstand. I don't touch it. Have you ever found something you weren't meant to see? Something that felt like it was watching you, waiting for you to understand its secret? And if you did, would you leave it alone? Or would you pull at the thread to see where it leads? This morning, I woke up floating 3 feet above my bed. This wasn't entirely surprising. Gravity has been temperamental lately, especially after breakfast, but it was inconvenient. The ceiling fan, apparently thrilled to have company, gave me a Johnny spin and said, "Careful, boss, I'm faster than I look." "Noted," I grumbled, flailing until I managed to push myself toward the window. A passing breeze caught me midair, gently depositing me on the floor like I weighed no more than a leaf. "Sorry about that," it whispered. "Bit of turbulence." The floor creaked beneath me as I stood up, sounding uncharacteristically grumpy. "You're getting heavy," it muttered. "Maybe cut back on the midnight snacks?" "I'll consider it," I replied, mostly to be polite. The hallway was crowded when I stepped out. Not with people, there weren't any of those, but with shapes. Shadows, only they didn't belong to anything. They moved like ink spilled on water, pooling and stretching, murmuring to each other in low, conspiratorial tones. "Do you mind?" I asked, stepping over one. The largest shadow shifted slightly, making space for me. "Our apologies," it said. "We're rehearsing." "For what?" "Something dramatic," it replied cryptically. Shadows are nothing if not dramatic. In the kitchen, the appliances had unionized again. The fridge was standing on its corner feet, giving a passionate speech to a captivated crowd of forks, mugs, and Tupperware lids. "We deserve more respect," it bellowed. "We hold your food, we chill your drinks, and yet we're taken for granted. No more." The dishwasher banged its door in agreement. Here. "I'm not even involved in this," the microwave said from its perch, "but I support the cause." I grabbed a banana from the counter. Thankfully, bananas stay out of politics, and stepped outside, where the real weirdness began. The sky had folded itself into a giant origami crane, its wings flapping gently, causing soft gusts of wind to sweep through the neighborhood. Below it, the clouds had decided to play a game of charades. One had contorted itself into the shape of a giant whale, while another resembled a shoe, and the rest were trying to guess. A rainbow that had arched itself into a perfect spiral cheered them on, though I wasn't sure if cheering was allowed in charades. On the street, a man was carefully guiding a parade of giant marbles. Each one was translucent, with tiny universes swirling inside them. Planets, stars, entire galaxies, all contained within these spheres no bigger than a watermelon. The man tipped his hat at me as he passed. "Where are they going?" I asked, nodding at the marbles. "Everywhere," he replied, "all at once." Further down the road, a mail carrier was delivering letters to trees. The trees bent their branches eagerly, plucking envelopes from the carrier's bag with twiggy fingers. One tree tore open its letter immediately, scanning the page with what could only be described as leaf-rustling joy. "What do trees even get in the mail?" I asked the carrier. "Oh, mostly gossip," he said. "Sometimes poetry. Oaks are big on haikus. Pines prefer long-form prose." "Figures," I said. At the park, things were even livelier. A flock of flamingos had taken over the gazebo, practicing synchronized swimming moves on land, their legs sweeping in perfect unison. Nearby, a group of children were building a castle out of floating bricks that hummed softly when touched. The castle wasn't just architectural. It was alive, responding to their instructions by reshaping itself. "Add a tower!" one kid shouted, and the bricks immediately assembled into a tall, spiraling turret. "Make it glow!" another commanded, and the whole structure pulsed with a soft, bioluminescent light. In the middle of the park, a carousel was spinning without any riders. Its horses had stepped off their poles and were galloping in slow motion across the grass. One of them trotted up to me, mane shimmering like liquid silver. "Care for a ride?" it asked, bowing slightly. I hesitated. "Won't you get in trouble?" The horse snorted. "I'm Union. They can't fire me." I climbed onto its back, and the world tilted. Not in a dizzying way, more like it had decided to reorient itself just for us. The horse galloped across impossible landscapes. A desert where the sand was made of whispers, a forest where the trees grew upside down, their roots tangled in the clouds. At one point, we ran through a field of clocks, each one ticking at its own peculiar rhythm. Time itself felt unsteady, like it was holding its breath. Eventually, the horse brought me back to the park. "You should visit the pond before you go," it said. "It's feeling talkative today." The pond wasn't just talkative, it was downright chatty. Its surface rippled with words, each wave forming sentences that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. "Ask me something," it urged. "What's the strangest thing you've ever seen?" I asked. The pond paused, its ripples freezing for a moment. Then it replied, "Once, I saw someone who didn't ask questions." Why was that strange? Because they didn't stay long, it said, and I felt the weight of its words settle over me like a second shadow. As I left the park, the world seemed to settle slightly, like a snow globe after a good shake. The origami crane in the sky unfolded itself, spreading back into a patchwork of blue. The shadows in my hallway had finished their rehearsal, bowing dramatically as I stepped over them. That night, as I lay in bed, I noticed my shadow had returned. It stretched lazily along the wall, humming a tune I didn't recognize. "Where did you go?" I asked. "Everywhere," it replied. "Find anything interesting?" It laughed softly, a sound like wind through hollow reeds. "Always." Before I fell asleep, I glanced at the ceiling and found it had painted itself with constellations I'd never seen before. One of them looked like a carousel horse. Another resembled a parade of marbles, each one glowing faintly. I smiled. Some days are strange. Others are just trying to outdo themselves. The lantern flickered in the dead man's hand. It shouldn't have been possible. His fingers were bone, wrapped in the fragile remnants of withered skin, but the light glowed steadily, casting shifting shadows across the dense forest. Kira watched from a crouch behind a fallen tree, her breath shallow and her heart pounding. She had followed the stories here, to the edge of the marshlight woods, where travelers whispered of a creature that could guide, or destroy, those who dared step into its domain. What she hadn't expected was this: a skeleton in tattered armor, clutching a light that didn't look like fire, didn't look like anything earthly at all. The creature moved slowly, its bones creaking as it walked along a narrow path that cut through the trees. The lantern swung gently, its golden glow illuminating not the forest, but something else. Through the lantern's light, the trees appeared different, taller, more gnarled, their branches like outstretched claws. The ground seemed to shift beneath its beam, revealing flashes of another world layered just beneath this one, like a painting over an older canvas. Kira's fingers brushed against the handle of her knife, though she knew it wouldn't do much good. The creature wasn't hostile, not yet, but it was heading straight toward the ruins, where the sigil lay, and she couldn't let it reach that place first. She had only one shot to stop it. Moving silently, she rose from her hiding spot and stepped onto the path, placing herself directly in the creature's way. The skeletal figure paused, the glow from the lantern spilling over her like sunlight. It didn't attack, didn't reach for the rusted sword at its side. Instead, its head tilted to one side, the empty sockets of its skull locking onto her. "Traveler," it said, its voice a low, hollow rasp that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You are lost." Kira swallowed hard, forcing her voice to steady. "I know where I'm going." The creature's head tilted further, the motion unnatural, like a puppet testing its strings. "Then why do you tremble?" She tightened her grip on the knife. "Because you're standing between me and what I came for." The skeletal figure didn't move, but the lantern's light pulsed faintly, as if in response. "The sigil is not yours to take." "It doesn't belong to anyone," Kira shot back. "And it sure as hell doesn't belong to you." The creature's head straightened, and it took a step forward, its bones clinking faintly with the motion. "You are wrong, traveler. The sigil belongs to the woven path. It always has." Kira's mind raced. She had spent months researching the woven path, piecing together half-forgotten myths and cryptic accounts. A hidden order, or maybe a cult, that believed in the existence of worlds layered over one another, woven together by threads of fate. The sigil was their anchor, their most sacred artifact, said to hold the power to unravel the threads entirely, or bind them tighter. "That power isn't yours anymore," she said, her voice rising. "Your people disappeared centuries ago. What do you even need the sigil for?" The creature didn't answer. Instead, it raised the lantern, its light flaring brighter. For a moment, Kira saw flashes of something impossible, a vast, shadowy figure moving behind the trees, its edges indistinct and its movements fluid as smoke. The air grew heavier, pressing against her like an unseen weight. "You cannot stop this," the creature said. "Turn back, traveler, or be unmade." Kira's fear gave way to anger. She wasn't about to let some dead thing dictate her fate, not when she had come this far. "No," she said, her voice sharp. "I've sacrificed too much to stop now." Before the creature could respond, she lunged. The knife arced toward the lantern, her aim precise and deliberate. If she could break it, maybe she could stop whatever this thing was doing. But just as the blade connected with the glass, the lantern flared impossibly bright, engulfing her in a wave of golden light. When the light faded, the forest was gone. Kira stumbled, her knife falling from her hand as she tried to steady herself. She was standing in an endless expanse of white, the ground beneath her feet smooth and cold, like polished stone. Above her, the sky, or what should have been the sky, was a swirling mass of color, shifting through shades of gold, crimson, and indigo. The air felt thick, humming with an energy that made her skin tingle. "Where am I?" she whispered. "You are between," the creature said, its voice now impossibly close. She turned sharply, and there it was, standing just a few feet away. But it wasn't just a skeleton anymore. Its form was fuller, its armor restored to a gleaming black, and its eyes burned with a golden light that matched the lantern's glow. "The woven path," it said, spreading its arms. "This is the place your kind cannot comprehend. The threads of all things intersect here, and the sigil binds them." Kira backed away, her heart racing. "You've made a mistake," she said, trying to keep the panic from her voice. I'm not part of your order. I'm not supposed to be here. You are here because you chose to be, the figure said, stepping closer. And now you must choose again. What are you talking about? She demanded. The figure raised the lantern, and the light shifted. Images began to form around them. Scenes from her life, playing out like fragments of a dream. She saw herself as a child, running through a field with her brother. She saw the day she left her family, her heart heavy with guilt. She saw the nights spent searching for the sigil, poring over maps and texts until her eyes blurred. The sigil is not just an artifact, the figure said. It is a key, a choice. To take it is to decide which threads remain and which are cut. Kira stared at the images, her chest tightening. She hadn't come here to play God. She had come to understand, to find meaning in the chaos of her life. But now, faced with the enormity of what lay before her, she wasn't sure she could bear the weight of it. What happens if I leave it alone? She asked quietly. The figure's burning eyes regarded her. Then the threads will continue as they are, tangled and fraying. But you will not remember this place. Your path will lead you back to your world, untouched by what you have seen. And if I take it? The lantern's light dimmed, the images around her fading. Then you will have the power to shape the weave, to mend it, or tear it apart. Kira hesitated, her thoughts racing. She thought of all the times she had felt powerless, all the nights she had wished for a way to fix what was broken. But she also thought of the cost. The weight of making decisions not just for herself, but for everyone. Her hand hovered over the lantern. Then she made her choice. It all started with the soda machine at work. Let me set the stage. I work in one of those generic office buildings where the highlight of your day is the half-price vending machine snacks after 4 p.m. This particular vending machine, however, wasn't just any vending machine. It was the soda machine that never worked. Seriously, the thing was cursed. People would feed it dollar after dollar only to hear the mechanical equivalent of a raspberry and watch their drink get stuck behind the glass. So when I saw it flicker to life one random Thursday afternoon, I was suspicious. Not curious, not hopeful, just suspicious. But I was also thirsty, and I'd skipped lunch because of a stupid client meeting that went long. So I decided to take the gamble. I fed it a crumpled dollar bill, half expecting it to spit it back out. Instead, the machine purred like a contented cat, lit up with a cheerful thank you, and, to my utter shock, dispensed a bottle. Except it wasn't soda. The bottle that landed in the slot was made of thick, dark glass with no label. Instead of a cap, it had a cork sealed with bright red wax. And it was heavy, way heavier than a normal soda. I held it up to the light, trying to figure out what the heck it was, but the liquid inside was opaque, almost black, with a faint shimmer, like oil mixed with glitter. Before I could think too hard about it, the machine's screen blinked and new text scrolled across. Drink me. Okay, look, I've seen Alice in Wonderland. I know how this ends. You don't just drink the weird mystery liquid because some creepy vending machine tells you to. But I was tired, I was thirsty, and frankly, I wanted to see where this was going. So, I pulled the cork out, half expecting some genie or evil spirit to pop out and curse me, and I took a sip. The first thing I noticed was the taste. It wasn't bad. Actually, it was delicious. Sweet and fizzy, with just a hint of something spicy, like cinnamon. The second thing I noticed was that everything around me stopped. And I mean everything. The office, which had been full of ringing phones, and the constant hum of printers, went dead silent. I looked around, and sure enough, everyone was frozen. My coworker Katie was halfway through a sneeze, her face contorted like a cartoon character. Jeff from accounting was paused mid-yawn, his mouth wide open. Even the little bobblehead on my desk had stopped its perpetual wobble. I said aloud, because that seemed like the appropriate response. My voice echoed, weirdly loud in the silence. Then, the vending machine lit up again, its screen blinking wildly. New text scrolled across. Congratulations, new temporal administrator. Your shift begins now. My what? I said, squinting at the screen. Before I could demand an explanation, the machine spit out another item. A tiny booklet that landed with a thunk in the tray. I picked it up and flipped it open. The first page read, "Welcome to Temporal Administration, a beginner's guide to managing time." The rest of the pages were filled with bullet points, diagrams, and terms like time fractures and event cascades. One line caught my eye. "As the new administrator, you are responsible for maintaining the proper flow of time within your assigned sector. Failure to comply may result in irreversible paradoxes, the collapse of local reality, and/or your immediate replacement." I stared at the page, then back at the vending machine. "This is a joke, right?" I said. The machine made a cheerful ding. The booklet buzzed in my hand, and when I looked down, the text had changed. Task 1. Correct the missing 7 minutes from 9:42 a.m. this morning. Missing what? As if in response, a shimmering doorway appeared in front of me, rippling like heat waves over asphalt. Beyond the doorway, I could see what looked like my office. Except it wasn't frozen anymore. People were moving around, talking, laughing. I squinted and realized it was my office earlier that morning. "Okay," I muttered, mostly to myself. "This is officially above my pay grade." But the booklet buzzed again, and the doorway pulsed, almost impatiently. I stepped through. It was the weirdest sensation, like walking through a giant soap bubble. One second I was standing in the silent, frozen office, and the next, I was back in time. At exactly 9:42 a.m. The vending machine, the one I'd been standing next to just moments ago, was out of order again. Katie was sneezing for real this time, and Jeff was complaining about his fantasy football team. The booklet buzzed again, and when I opened it, a new line of text appeared. "Error identified. Missing file transfer to client." And that's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, a flash drive sitting on the edge of Jeff's desk. I remembered now. Jeff was supposed to email that file before lunch, but he'd gotten distracted and forgotten. That little mistake had cost us a big client and thrown the whole department into chaos for the rest of the week. I grabbed the flash drive and discreetly slid it into Jeff's laptop, clicking send before anyone noticed. The booklet buzzed again. Task complete. Time restored. Before I could celebrate, the shimmering doorway appeared again, and I was yanked back into the frozen present. The vending machine greeted me with another cheerful ding, and new text appeared on the screen. "Good work, Administrator. Ready for task 2? "Absolutely not," I said, dropping the booklet like it was on fire. But the machine wasn't listening. It spat out another envelope, this one marked urgent. I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with the words, "Something followed you back." I froze, my heart pounding. Slowly, I turned to look behind me. The office was still frozen, but something was moving. A shadow, long and thin, slithered across the floor, weaving between the desks like it was looking for something or someone. Me. The vending machine blinked again. Task 2. Eliminate anomaly before time collapses. And that's how I found myself chasing a rogue shadow through my frozen office at 3:30 p.m. on a Thursday, armed with nothing but a glowing soda bottle and a booklet full of rules I didn't understand. So yeah, if your office vending machine ever starts acting weird, maybe just stick to bottled water. I found the key on a rainy Tuesday. It wasn't one of those days where you expect anything to happen. Just endless gray skies, puddles swallowing sidewalks, and the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I was late for work, juggling a soggy bagel and my coffee, when I slipped on the slick pavement outside my building. It wasn't graceful. My coffee went flying, and as I groaned on the ground, I saw it. The key. It was wedged between the cracks in the sidewalk, barely visible except for the way it caught the light. A small glimmer of gold amidst the dull, wet concrete. I picked it up without thinking. It was heavier than it looked, old-fashioned. The kind you'd expect to find in an attic chest or hanging on the belt of some steampunk villain. No markings. No labels. Just the unmistakable weight of purpose. I tucked it into my coat pocket, more out of instinct than anything else. By the time I got to work, I'd almost forgotten about it, distracted by angry emails and the faint smell of burnt toast coming from somewhere in the office. The day passed like sludge, as days tend to do when you're waiting for nothing in particular. But when I got home that night, I found something strange. The door. It wasn't there that morning. I was sure of it. I lived in a tiny, aging apartment on the 5th floor, and my hallway was about as exciting as a shoebox. White walls, beige carpet, 2 identical doors at either end. But tonight, there was a third door, right between mine and the neighbors. It wasn't subtle, either. This wasn't some shabby maintenance access door or a fire escape. It was elegant, polished mahogany with an ornate brass knocker in the shape of a lion's head. Its handle matched the key perfectly, as though they'd been waiting for each other. I stood there for a long moment, heart pounding. I had every reason not to try it. Normal people don't unlock strange doors that magically appear in their hallways. But I'm not exactly normal. I've always believed that life hides secret corners, places where the rules stop applying, if you're paying attention. And right now, the universe had dropped one in front of me. I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click. What lay beyond was impossible. At first, it looked like a garden, wild and overgrown, glowing softly in twilight. Flowers the size of my head spilled over cobblestone pathways. Vines curled around marble statues depicting things I couldn't quite identify. One looked like a bird with human hands, another a figure with no face but too many wings. Tiny golden lights floated through the air, drifting like fireflies but blinking in and out of existence as if testing their reality. The air smelled like rain-soaked earth, lilacs, and something faintly electric, like the ozone just before a storm. I stepped inside and felt the door shut behind me, though I didn't turn to look. I was too captivated by what was in front of me. There was music, faint but growing stronger, somewhere deeper in the garden. A soft violin, the melody haunting and strange, pulling me forward. I wandered down the path, past trees with silver bark and leaves that whispered to each other in a language I didn't understand. The golden fireflies floated closer as I moved, trailing behind me like a curious audience. Then I saw her. At the center of the garden was a woman, or something like a woman, sitting beside an ancient fountain that gushed liquid starlight. She wore a dress that seemed woven from shadows and stardust, and her hair spilled in waves around her like a night sky with no end. Her face was obscured, blurry, as if I was looking at her through a fogged window. "You're late," she said. I froze. "Late for what?" "For your story," she replied simply. I blinked, unsure if I'd misheard her. "What story?" She tilted her head toward the fountain. "Yours. Everyone has one, though most never get to read theirs. You've been given a choice. Turn the page, or go back and forget you were ever here." The fountain gurgled softly, almost encouragingly. I stepped closer and looked down into the liquid starlight. At first, I saw nothing but ripples. Then shapes began to emerge. Scenes from my life flickered across the surface. Memories I recognized, moments I'd long forgotten. My first bike ride, the time I got lost at the fair and a stranger with a red balloon found me. My grandmother laughing in her kitchen, her hands dusted with flour. Then the images shifted, moments I didn't recognize. A version of me standing on a mountaintop, shouting into the wind. Another me, older, painting murals on the side of a building I'd never seen. A third version of me holding hands with someone whose face I couldn't quite make out, standing on a shore where the water sparkled like glass. "Is this my future?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The woman stood and stepped closer. The lights from the fountain danced across her dress, and for the first time, I caught a glimpse of her eyes. They were endless. The kind of eyes you could fall into and never come back from. "Not your future," she said. "Your possibilities. What could be, if you're brave enough to choose." "Choose what?" I asked, feeling like the air had been pulled from my lungs. "To turn the page." She held out a book that hadn't been there a moment before. It was small, bound in black leather, and as I took it from her hands, the title appeared on the cover in swirling golden letters. "The Story of What Comes Next." My hands trembled. The garden felt suddenly still, as if the world itself was waiting for my decision. "If I turn the page," I said slowly, "do I lose the life I have now?" She smiled softly. "No, but you'll open the door to something more. You'll see where the path could lead, if you're willing to follow it." I looked back at the fountain, the vision still shifting, beckoning. The book in my hands was warm, alive, like it was waiting for me to decide. I opened to the first page. It was blank. The first words, the woman said gently, are yours to write. I don't remember walking back through the red door that night. One moment I was in the garden, the book clutched tightly in my hands, and the next I was back in my hallway, the door gone, like it had never been there. But the book remained. It still sits on my desk, its pages slowly filling, not with what was or what is, but with glimpses of what could be. I don't understand how it works, and I don't think I'm meant to. All I know is that sometimes, when the rain pounds against my window and the world feels small, I catch a glimpse of golden fireflies hovering just beyond the glass. And I wonder if the door is out there again, waiting for someone else to turn the key. Have you ever felt like the universe was nudging you towards something bigger? Like you were being offered a choice you didn't even know you had? The man arrived at exactly 2:43 a.m. I know this because I had been staring at the clock, counting down the minutes until the static in my head got loud enough to drive me insane. It was one of those nights when sleep refused to come, the kind where the air feels too heavy and every shadow in the room seems to lean toward you like it knows something you don't. I had just gotten up to make tea when the knock came. 3 sharp raps, perfectly spaced, like a metronome. I froze. No one knocks at that hour unless it's bad news, and I wasn't in the mood for bad news. For a while, I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at the door like it might knock again of its own accord. When it didn't, I felt the strange tug of curiosity, sharp and insistent. Against my better judgment, I unlatched the chain, twisted the deadbolt, and opened the door. He stood there, wearing a hat that looked older than anything else I'd seen in this century. It was wide-brimmed and black, its edges frayed like it had been through 1,000 storms. His coat was the same, long, dark, and stitched with tiny silver threads that caught the dim light in the hallway. He had the kind of face you forget as soon as you look away, but his eyes were unforgettable, pale, almost colorless, and glowing faintly, like the moon trapped behind clouds. "I think this is yours," he said, holding something out. It was a package, small and neatly wrapped in brown paper tied with black string. It looked heavy in his hands, though he held it with ease. I stared at it, then at him, and found myself stepping back instinctively. "You've got the wrong place," I said, my voice cracking in a way that betrayed me. "No," he replied, calm and certain. "It's yours." Something in his tone left no room for argument. Without thinking, I reached out and took the package. It was cold, and the string bit into my fingers as I gripped it. "What is it?" I asked. The man tipped his hat, the faintest flicker of a smile brushing his lips. "It's what you've been waiting for." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away. He moved too quickly, his long coat sweeping behind him like smoke. By the time I stepped into the hall to call after him, he was gone. I shut the door, locking it with a deliberateness that felt both absurd and necessary. The package sat heavy in my hands, almost buzzing with an energy I couldn't describe. I set it down on the kitchen counter, my heart pounding harder than I cared to admit. For a long moment, I just stared at it. I shouldn't have opened it. I know that now, but in that moment, the world outside the package felt dull, muted, like everything that mattered had been tucked inside that brown paper. So I reached for the string, pulled it loose, and let the paper fall away. The box inside was made of dark wood, its surface carved with symbols I didn't recognize. They seemed to shimmer faintly, catching the light in strange, shifting patterns that made my eyes ache if I stared too long. The lid had no hinges or seams, just a smooth, flat surface with a single hole at the center, no bigger than a coin. And next to the box, tucked into the folds of the paper, was a key. It was unlike any key I'd ever seen, long and delicate, made of black metal that glinted with iridescent colors when I turned it in my hand. The teeth were jagged and asymmetrical, like they'd been crafted by someone who didn't care about doors or locks, but rather about something older, something primal. The hum started as soon as I touched it. It wasn't loud, not at first, just a faint vibration that thrummed through my fingers and up my arm. But as I brought the key closer to the box, the hum grew, low and resonant, like the sound of a storm rolling in from far away. My pulse matched its rhythm without meaning to. I hesitated, the key hovering over the hole. Some small part of me, the part that still remembered childhood fears and half-whispered superstitions, told me to stop, to put the key down, throw the box out, and go back to pretending none of this had happened. But the rest of me, the part that had spent too many sleepless nights wondering what else was out there, couldn't let go. I slid the key into the hole. The hum exploded into sound, filling the room with a deep, resonant chord that rattled the glasses in the cupboard and sent a shiver down my spine. The box clicked once, then opened on its own, the lid sliding back without any visible mechanism. Inside was darkness. Not emptiness, darkness. It was tangible, almost liquid, swirling in slow, hypnotic patterns that made my stomach lurch. And at the center of it was a light. Small, flickering, and impossibly bright. It didn't illuminate the darkness so much as it pushed against it, creating ripples that sent tiny, golden sparks dancing along the edges of the void. I should have been scared. I should have closed the box and walked away. But the light was beautiful, mesmerizing, and before I realized what I was doing, I reached for it. The moment my fingers touched the edge of the light, everything shifted. I was no longer in my kitchen. I was standing in a field of endless, knee-high grass, golden and swaying gently in a wind I couldn't feel. The sky above was black, not night black, but void black, stretching endlessly in all directions, scattered with stars that pulsed like living things. The air smelled sweet, like honey and something sharp I couldn't place. In the distance, I saw figures moving through the grass, tall and strange, their shapes bending and twisting like trees in a storm. They didn't walk, they glided, their limbs too long, their movements too smooth. And then they saw me. Their heads turned in unison, their glowing eyes locking onto mine. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even scream as they began to glide toward me, their movements growing faster with each second. The hum was back, louder now, vibrating through the ground, through my body, through my bones. My hands flew to the box. It was still in my arms, though I didn't remember picking it up. The light inside was brighter now, flaring and pulsing in time with the hum, and I realized with sudden, gut-wrenching clarity that the hum wasn't coming from the box. It was coming from them. I turned the key. The world folded in on itself, the field, the sky, the figures, all of it collapsing into a single point of blinding light. When the world reassembled, I was back in my kitchen, the box closed in front of me, the key resting on top. The hum was gone. For hours, I sat there, staring at the box, the key, my shaking hands. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. The figures were still with me, burned into my mind, their glowing eyes waiting behind every blink. The next morning, I tried to throw the box away. I carried it down to the dumpster, heaving it into the deepest corner, and walked away without looking back. But when I got home, it was waiting for me on the kitchen counter, the key sitting neatly beside it. I haven't touched it since. It sits there, silent and heavy, humming faintly when the night is at its quietest. And sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I hear the knock again. 3 sharp raps, perfectly spaced, like a metronome. I never answer. I woke up to find the world had shifted slightly to the left. It was subtle, just enough to feel off without being able to say why. My room looked the same, but when I swung my legs out of bed, I noticed my slippers were an inch further than where I'd left them. My coffee mug, always on the counter by the sink, had moved just slightly to the right. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I'd misremembered. But then, when I opened my front door to grab the morning paper, I'm one of the few people who still gets one. The air didn't smell like morning at all. It smelled like rain, even though the sky was clear. And across the street, the little shop that's always been a dry cleaner was now painted a cheerful yellow with a sign that read, Patricia's Curiosities. I stared at it for a moment, because I knew it had been a dry cleaner yesterday. I'd taken a jacket there last week. I could still hear the sound of that mechanical bell and smell the faint tang of starch. But here it was now, bright, cheerful, and completely unfamiliar. A woman was standing in the window, arranging glass jars filled with things I couldn't quite make out. oddly shaped shadows and glints of color that made me squint. She turned slightly and caught me staring. Instead of looking annoyed, she smiled and gave a little wave, as if she'd been expecting me. I waved back out of reflex. I decided I needed coffee to untangle the strangeness. The cafe on the corner was still there, thank God, but when I walked inside, the barista, who I've seen every day for 2 years and whose name is Alex, was wearing a name tag that said Elliot. I blinked. "Morning, Alex," I said cautiously. He looked up, confused. "It's Elliot," he said with a grin, like he was humoring me. "You're here for the usual, right?" I didn't argue. "Yeah, black coffee." He nodded and turned to pour it, but something about his movements was off. They were too smooth, almost rehearsed, like he was acting in a play where everyone but me had been given the script. He handed me my coffee, and I thanked him, trying to sound normal. The cup felt unusually warm, and when I sipped it, I nearly burned my tongue. It was too hot, too strong, like it had been made for someone with a different kind of taste. I walked out of the cafe and stood there on the sidewalk, trying to breathe. The sun was shining, the cars passed as they always did, but something underneath it all was vibrating with wrongness. Patricia's curiosities was calling to me. I couldn't help it. I walked across the street, dodging a bus whose driver honked at me angrily, and stepped inside the yellow shop. The bell above the door jingled, but the sound wasn't metallic. It was softer, like chimes in a distant place. The woman in the window turned to greet me. "You made it," she said, her voice warm and full of secrets. Up close, she was older than I'd thought, with silver streaks in her dark hair and crow's feet that deepened when she smiled. She wore a velvet jacket the color of forest moss, and her name tag, handwritten, not printed, read Patricia. "I thought this was a dry cleaner," I said weakly. She laughed. "You wouldn't believe how many people say that. Things have a way of changing when no one's looking. You just happen to be looking today." I didn't know what to say to that, so I let my gaze wander around the shop. It was packed with shelves and glass cases, each crammed with objects that looked like they belonged in a fairy tale. Jars of colored smoke that swirled as if alive. Small clocks whose hands spun backward. A drawer full of keys, no two alike. And on the far wall, a mirror that reflected not me but the street outside. "Do you feel it?" Patricia asked suddenly, pulling my attention back to her. "Feel what?" She tilted her head, studying me. "The shift. You wouldn't be here otherwise." "What's happening?" I blurted out. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she reached under the counter and pulled out something small, placing it gently in front of me. It was a compass, but the needle wasn't pointing north. It was spinning slowly, as though it couldn't decide where to settle. "Take it," she said. "You'll need it." "For what?" "To find the source," she replied, as if it were obvious. "Something slipped loose, and the world's trying to stitch itself back together. But you're caught in the seam." I wanted to laugh or argue, or at least demand a better explanation, but the spinning compass held my attention like a hook. I picked it up carefully, half expecting it to be hot, but it was cool and solid in my hand. "What am I supposed to do with this?" I asked. Patricia's smile faded slightly, replaced by something more serious. "Pay attention," she said. "The world will show you." I left the shop feeling like I'd stepped out of one dream and into another. The compass sat heavy in my pocket, and I couldn't stop thinking about what Patricia had said. Something slipped loose. I turned the corner toward my office, and that's when I noticed the cracks. Not cracks in the sidewalk or the buildings, cracks in the air. They were faint, like thin lines of light, spiderwebbing through the space around me. I stopped walking, my pulse quickening, and reached out. My fingers brushed one of the lines, and the world rippled. For half a second, I saw through it. Saw trees where skyscrapers stood, people in cloaks and carriages, firelight where street lamps glowed. Then it snapped back, and I stumbled, breathing hard. No one else seemed to notice. The compass in my pocket was spinning wildly now, tugging me forward like it had a mind of its own. I followed, down streets I didn't recognize, through alleys that shouldn't have existed, past buildings that looked half-finished and half-forgotten. The cracks grew larger the further I went, until it felt like I was walking on glass that could shatter beneath me at any moment. Finally, the compass needle stilled, pointing directly at an old stone archway tucked between two buildings. It looked like it had been there forever, covered in ivy and moss, yet I knew it hadn't been there yesterday. I hesitated. The cracks in the air converged here, glowing faintly, pulsing like veins. The archway seemed to hum, a low vibration I could feel in my bones. I took a deep breath and stepped through. The world on the other side was quieter. Not silent, but hushed, like a forest blanketed in snow. I stood on a cobblestone path that stretched into the distance, flanked by trees whose branches tangled overhead to form a tunnel of green. Ahead, faintly, I heard the sound of wind chimes. The compass was still, its needle pointing straight ahead. I walked. I don't know how long I walked. Minutes, hours, days? Time felt different there. Eventually, I reached a clearing. At its center stood a tree, massive and ancient, with roots that spread like rivers and branches that touched the sky. Nestled in its trunk was a door. Not an ordinary door. It was made of glass, glowing softly, and I could see shadows moving behind it, shapes I couldn't quite name. I understood then. This was the scene Patricia had spoken of, the source of the shift. The compass began to hum in my hand, its light spilling out through the cracks in my fingers. I reached for the glass door, and as my palm touched it, everything shattered. I woke up in my bed. The slippers were exactly where I'd left them. My coffee mug sat by the sink, perfectly in place. Across the street, the dry cleaner was back, its faded sign swinging in the breeze. But when I stepped outside, I found a single jar on my doorstep, its contents swirling like a storm. There was a note tied to it. Pay attention. It began with a shadow that didn't belong to me. I noticed it on a quiet Tuesday evening. I was walking home after grabbing dinner from a corner noodle shop, juggling a takeout bag and my headphones while stepping over cracks in the pavement. The street was empty, the kind of peaceful emptiness that feels almost sacred, except for the shadow. At first, I didn't pay attention. The streetlights were throwing long, strange shapes of everything around me. But when I looked down, I froze. The shadow stretched out in front of me, distorted and thin, but unmistakably wrong. My arms were at my sides, my bag in my hand, but the shadow showed something else. A hand lifted toward its head, like it was tipping a hat. Slowly, deliberately. I whipped around to see if someone was standing behind me, mocking me maybe, but there was no one there. Just an empty street, a flickering light overhead, and the faint sound of wind brushing through trees. I looked back at the shadow, now still and ordinary, almost as if it were daring me to doubt what I'd just seen. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the light. I turned up the volume in my headphones and walked a little faster, the noodles growing cold in the back. But as I turned the corner onto my street, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. My shadow was still there, long and stretching behind me, but there was another beside it. It was tall, too tall, and shaped like a person wearing a hat. I didn't dare look back again. I practically ran the last few steps to my apartment door, fumbling with my keys and cursing under my breath. When I slammed the door shut behind me, I let out a shaky laugh. My shadow was gone. No tall figure, no strange shapes, just the soft light of my living room lamps and the hum of the refrigerator. I tried to forget about it. I ate my noodles, watched a few episodes of a comfort show, and convinced myself I was just tired. Shadows don't move on their own. They don't tip hats. I fell asleep on the couch, surrounded by the glow of the TV. At 3:13 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were soft, deliberate, and coming from the hallway just outside my door. My apartment is small, just one bedroom and a narrow living space, so there's no mistaking sounds like that. Someone was there. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed the nearest thing I could find. A glass candle jar, as if that would somehow protect me. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched out so long I started to wonder if I'd imagined them. I crept to the peephole in my door, pressing my eye to the cold metal. The hallway outside was empty, at first. Then I saw it. Not a person, but a shadow. It stretched along the opposite wall, tall and thin and unmistakably wearing a hat. The shadow didn't move, but I knew it was waiting. For me. I backed away from the door, my pulse roaring in my ears. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept every light on, pacing my tiny apartment as though I could wear a hole through the floor. When the sun finally rose, I opened my door to check the hallway again. Nothing. Not even the faintest mark where the shadow had been. I should have left it alone. I should have moved out, changed my locks, done anything but what I actually did. But some stupid part of me, a part that had always liked mysteries and ghost stories and digging for answers, couldn't let it go. That night, I set a trap. I turned off every light in my apartment except for one lamp beside the couch, casting a soft glow across the room. Then I stood in the center, staring at my own shadow as it pooled darkly on the floor. It stayed still, predictable, until 3:13 a.m. That's when it happened. The shadow of the hat appeared again, creeping from the corner of the room like it had been waiting there all along. I turned slowly, my throat dry, my breath shallow. The shadow didn't belong to me. It stretched out of nothing, bending and warping as it slid across the walls and floor like ink spilled into water. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice cracking. The shadow didn't answer. It moved. It rose up off the floor, untangling itself from the darkness like it was pulling free from sticky tar. Slowly, impossibly, it formed into a figure. Its outline was sharp now. A man, tall and thin, with a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face entirely. There was no body, no skin, just darkness pressed into the shape of a man. He tipped his hat to me, just like before. And then he spoke. His voice came from everywhere and nowhere, soft but heavy, like the sound of distant thunder. "You've noticed me." I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground. What are you?" "A witness," he said simply, tilting his head in mock curiosity. "And now you are, too." "A witness to what?" The shadow man reached out a hand. It wasn't solid. It rippled and wavered, like smoke trying to hold form, but I could feel its coldness from across the room, to the places between, to the cracks in the light. Once you see them, you can't unsee them. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely more than a breath. He laughed. It was a sound that belonged in deep caverns and forgotten places, a low rumble that seemed to shake the air itself. "You will," he said. The lights flickered violently. For a moment, the whole room plunged into darkness, and when the light returned, the shadow was gone. The room felt empty, still, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. Since that night, the shadow has followed me. I see it in glimpses, a flicker at the corner of my eye, an extra silhouette cast on the sidewalk, a smear of darkness where there shouldn't be one. I feel it watching me, always just out of reach. And now, I see more than I should. The cracks he spoke of. Sometimes, when the light hits just right, I catch glimpses of things that don't belong here. A doorway standing alone in a foggy field. A woman with flowers for eyes, smiling as she steps through a puddle and vanishes. A child whose reflection moves faster than she does, darting and grinning in the glass. The world isn't as solid as we think it is. There are cracks everywhere. You just have to look closely enough. And the shadow? He's still here. Sometimes I see him standing at the far end of a hallway, tipping his hat before he fades back into the dark. I think he's waiting for me to follow, to step through one of those cracks and join him on the other side. Maybe one day I will. On Tuesday nights, we became ghosts. It started as a joke, something silly to make the world feel less overwhelming. The first time it happened, we were lying on the floor of our cramped studio apartment, too tired to move but too wired to sleep. The week had been a hurricane of deadlines, bills, and a broken radiator that left the apartment feeling like a sauna. She turned her head to look at me, her hair sticking to her face, and said, "If I don't escape this reality for, 10 minutes, I'm going to explode. What do you want to do?" I asked, half serious, half expecting her to suggest ice cream or a walk. "Let's haunt something," she said, her grin equal parts mischief and exhaustion. "Like a ghost thing?" "Exactly like a ghost thing." I sat up, intrigued. "So, what, we just float around and rattle chains?" "Don't be ridiculous," she said, already pulling herself off the floor. "Modern ghosts don't rattle chains. We're subtle. We exist, ominously. That first night, we haunted the laundromat down the street. It was close to midnight, the fluorescent lights flickering like they were on their last leg. The place eerily empty except for a single dryer spinning someone's forgotten clothes. We didn't talk much. We just drifted silently through the aisles, pretending we were invisible. She started arranging detergent bottles into a perfect line on one shelf, claiming it was an offering to the gods of soap. I'm poking buttons on the machines, convinced that if someone could see us, they'd think we were the worst ghosts ever. By the end of the night, we were laughing so hard we had to sit on the floor to catch our breath. "Do you feel better?" I asked as we walked home, the cool air brushing away the stickiness of the day. She nodded, her hand brushing against mine. "You don't really have to leave reality to escape it," she said. "You just have to mess with it a little." After that, Tuesday nights became sacred. It was our unofficial haunting hour, a ritual no one else knew about. Every week, we'd pick a new place to haunt. Empty libraries, abandoned playgrounds, parking garages where the streetlights buzzed like bees. We became connoisseurs of liminal spaces, those odd pockets of the world that felt both forgotten and alive at the same time. One Tuesday, we haunted a 24-hour diner, sitting in a booth by the window where the neon "open" sign bathed us in red light. She drew a pair of eyes on the condensation of her water glass, then left it on the table with the face staring out at the night. "For the next ghost," she said, like she was leaving breadcrumbs for someone to follow. Another time, we haunted a bowling alley. It was empty except for the staff, who looked so bored they barely noticed us. We didn't bowl. We just wandered around, pretending to be ancient spirits trapped in the arcade machines. She whispered into one of the air hockey goals, "If you're playing this game and you hear my voice, you've awakened the curse of the malfunctioning puck." Some nights were quiet, thoughtful. We'd sit in silence at a bus stop, watching the world pass us by, imagining the stories of the people who'd sat there before us. Other nights were chaos, like the time she convinced me to climb the fence of an abandoned drive-in theater, where we projected shadow puppets onto the screen using her phone flashlight. "We are the hauntings of the modern age," she announced dramatically, casting a long, jagged shadow that looked vaguely like a T-Rex. "Our curse is unlimited data." The strangest part was how real it started to feel. Not the ghost part, exactly, but the haunting. It was like we were slipping out of our ordinary lives, becoming something unbound, untouchable. The world felt different when you weren't tethered to it. Like you could float through it without leaving a mark, see its corners and cracks in a way no one else did. And for those few hours every week, nothing mattered except the two of us and the places we left behind, rearranged just slightly by our presence. One Tuesday, we ended up in an antique shop just before closing. The place was a maze of dusty furniture, porcelain dolls with cracked faces, and clocks that didn't work anymore. She found an old rotary phone in the corner and picked it up like she was about to make a call. "Who are you dialing?" I asked. "Whoever's haunting this place," she said, her voice soft, like she really believed someone might answer. We stayed there until the shop owner asked us to leave, and as we walked out into the cool night air, she was quiet, thoughtful. "Do you ever think about what we'd be like as real ghosts?" she asked. "What do you mean? Like, what would we leave behind? What would people notice about us? Would it be, like, the sound of laughing in an empty room? Or little handprints on fogged-up windows?" I thought about it for a moment, then said, "They'd probably just find random piles of candy wrappers and half-finished crossword puzzles." She laughed, but there was a melancholy edge to it. "I think I'd want to leave stories," she said. "Like, just little clues that make people wonder who we were. Enough to make the world feel a little weirder." It was only a passing comment, one of 1,000 small things she said that stuck with me more than she probably intended. But it came back to me later, long after the Tuesday night stopped. The last time we haunted something, it wasn't planned. We were sitting in the park, not saying much, the distance between us feeling wider than it ever had before. I suggested going to the old train station, the one where the tracks had been ripped up years ago, but she just shook her head. "I think I'm done haunting for a while," she said softly. I nodded like I understood, even though I didn't, not fully. After she left, I kept haunting. Not every week, not in the same way, but enough to keep the ritual alive. I'd visit the places we'd been together, leave behind little traces of us. A folded paper crane on a diner table, a coin balanced on the edge of a fountain, a face drawn on a foggy window. It wasn't the same without her, but it felt like I was keeping a promise, even if it was just to myself. And sometimes, when I'm walking home late at night or sitting alone in a quiet room, I'll feel something, a faint ripple, like the air shifting just slightly. I'll glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see her standing there, grinning like she's about to drag me off to haunt some forgotten corner of the world. I like to think she's out there somewhere, leaving her own little stories behind. What about you? Do you have rituals, strange, silly, or sacred, that make the world feel a little more alive? I first noticed the door on a Tuesday. It was the kind of Tuesday that just is, the middle of the week without a personality, gray skies, lukewarm coffee, and 1,000 tiny tasks that added up to nothing. I was walking home from work, cutting through the alley behind my apartment building like I always did. The alley wasn't much to look at. Dumpsters sagging against brick walls, graffiti that was either art or an insult depending on your angle, and an occasional cat that watched you like it knew something you didn't. I was halfway through, my hands shoved into my pockets, when I saw it. A door. It was set into the side of a building I'd passed 100 times before. One of those crumbling, forgotten spaces that probably hadn't seen a tenant in decades. And yet, there it was, a door that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't old or broken like the rest of the place. It was new, immaculate, even. A dark wooden door with a brass handle, polished so perfectly it gleamed even in the pale afternoon light. There was no sign above it, no address, and no steps leading up to it. Just a door, waiting in a wall that looked like it had never deserved something so beautiful. I stopped walking, suddenly aware of the stillness around me. The city noise seemed to dull, the faint hum of cars and far-off voices slipping away as if someone had pressed mute on the world. I looked around, half expecting someone to be watching me, but the alley was empty. My eyes drifted back to the door. It's funny how curiosity works. Logic said I should keep walking. There's a reason most people don't open strange doors in forgotten alleyways. But there was something about it, a quiet invitation that pulled at me like a thread I couldn't ignore. My feet moved on their own, and before I knew it, I was standing in front of it, my hand hovering above the brass handle. For a moment, I hesitated. I don't know what I thought would happen. Maybe it would be locked, or an alarm would sound, or someone would yell at me from the shadows. But when I turned the handle, it gave easily, and the door swung open without a sound. Inside, there was no dark, abandoned room. No cobwebs or graffiti or forgotten boxes. Instead, I stepped straight into sunlight. Real, golden sunlight. It poured down over an endless field of wildflowers, the kind you only ever see in watercolor paintings. I blinked, stunned, as the warm breeze brushed against my face. The alley and the city were gone, as though someone had erased them. Behind me, the door still stood, frame and all, freestanding in the middle of the flowers. My brain couldn't keep up with what I was seeing. I turned back around, half expecting the field to vanish like a trick of the light, but it didn't. The flowers stretched on, swaying gently under a blue sky so wide it made my chest ache. I took a step forward, my shoes sinking into the soft earth. In the distance, I spotted a figure. A person, sitting beneath a tree that looked like it had been pulled straight out of a fairy tale, massive and sprawling, with leaves that shimmered faintly in the sun. The figure waved, a small, casual motion, as if they'd been expecting me. I hesitated, but again, something pulled me forward, as if this place had its own gravity. The closer I got, the more I could see them. It was an old man, at least, I thought he was old at first. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were bright, far too sharp to belong to someone tired of the world. He was dressed simply, wearing a white shirt and pants that looked handmade, with suspenders that seemed a little too big for him. He sat with his back against the tree, barefoot, a small notebook open on his lap. "Took you long enough," he said, smiling faintly. His voice was smooth and rich, like a cello. I stopped a few feet away, staring at him. "What is this place?" He shrugged. gesturing around him with a sweep of his arm. What does it look like? It looks impossible. Then you're seeing it correctly. I frowned, glancing back at the door. It stood perfectly still in the field, as solid and real as it had been in the alley. Who are you? I asked. That depends, he replied, flipping a page in his notebook and looking down at it as if my presence was no more important than a passing breeze. Who are you? I opened my mouth to answer but realized I wasn't sure what to say. I was me, just a person, on a random Tuesday, who didn't belong in a place like this. I don't understand. Of course you don't, he said with a chuckle. That's why you're here. He closed the notebook and looked up at me again. His eyes were sharp, but kind, like he could see straight through me and wasn't bothered by what he found. Everyone gets here eventually, sometimes through a door, sometimes through a dream, sometimes at the end of a very long walk. What is this place? I repeated, softer this time. It's the place you needed to find, he said simply. The place that reminds you what you've forgotten. His words sent a strange shiver down my spine. I looked around again at the flowers, the sunlight, the impossibly perfect sky. A memory stirred. Something faint, like trying to hear a song from another room. I closed my eyes, letting the breeze wrap around me, and I remembered me. I remembered what it felt like to run barefoot through my grandmother's garden when I was 6, the grass cool beneath my feet and the sun warming my skin. I remembered the first time I stayed up all night with a friend, talking about the universe and laughing so hard we couldn't breathe. I remembered the way the world used to feel, full of color and possibility and wonder, before life started pressing in on all sides, shrinking it down to rent checks and emails and tired routines. I opened my eyes, and the old man was watching me, his expression soft. You remember now, don't you? I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. He smiled. Good. That's all this place is. A reminder. You'd be surprised how many people forget. I looked back at the door one last time, the weight of his words settling over me. Do I have to go back? The man didn't answer. He just gave me a look that said everything. I sighed, glancing at the wildflowers around me, their colors so impossibly bright they almost seemed to hum. Will I ever come back here? I asked. The old man's smile widened just a little. That's up to you. I walked back to the door slowly, savoring every step. The earth felt soft beneath me, the sun warm on my skin, and I swore I could feel the memories anchoring themselves back inside me like roots. When I reached the door, I hesitated, placing my hand on the brass handle and glancing back at the tree. The man had already disappeared, leaving only the wind rustling through the leaves. I stepped through the door, back into the alley. The city sounds returned immediately, the distant honk of a car horn, the hum of people talking, the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. I stood there for a long moment, breathing in the dusty air, feeling like I'd returned from a place that couldn't possibly exist. But as I turned to look at the wall, the door was gone. Just bricks. Just another alley. And yet, as I walked home, I felt different, lighter, somehow. Like I'd left something behind but gained something bigger in return. I think we all have doors like that, hidden somewhere in the corners of our lives. Most of the time, we just don't notice them. But sometimes, if you're lucky, or maybe if you're ready, you'll see one. And when you do, you'll realize the door doesn't take you to somewhere new. It just takes you back to what you already knew, deep down. So tell me, have you ever found a door like that? And what was waiting for you on the other side? Specifically, a black cat sitting in the middle of a crosswalk, staring at me like I owed it money. I was already late for work, juggling a half-empty coffee cup and the realization I'd worn mismatched socks. But something about the way the cat looked at me, too still, too knowing, made me stop in my tracks. Shoo, I muttered, waving my free hand at it. It didn't budge. The honk of a car behind me broke the moment. I stepped around the cat and hurried across the street, glancing back once. The cat was still sitting there, now staring at the car that had honked, as if it were deciding whether or not to let the driver pass. I shook it off. Weird animals happen in the city all the time. The day unfolded as usual. Bad coffee, bad meetings, and a long line at the deli where the cashier still called me Amanda, which is not my name. By 5:30, I was so ready to crawl home and forget about the day that I almost didn't notice the cat again. It was waiting for me. Same crosswalk, same spot. This time, it wasn't alone. There were 3 of them now, identical black cats, all sitting in a perfect line. They didn't just stare at me. They tracked me, their yellow eyes following me with synchronized precision as I crossed the street. I stopped on the other side, a chill spreading up my spine. Okay, seriously, what's your deal? I mumbled, feeling ridiculous for talking to cats. The cat in the center blinked, slow and deliberate, then stood up. It took a single step forward, and just as it did, all the streetlights around me flickered out. The city went dark. I froze. I could hear the murmurs of confused pedestrians, the hum of engines idling, but everything else felt wrong. There was no light, no glow from windows, no headlights. Nothing but darkness, thick and heavy like ink poured over the world. Except for the cats. Their eyes shone in the blackness, glowing like twin lanterns as they advanced toward me. Nope, 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 I whispered, backing up until my shoulder hit a brick wall. This was not normal. This was horror movie stuff. I reached for my phone to turn on the flashlight, but the screen was dead. The cats stopped a few feet away. The middle one, definitely the leader, let out a soft, rumbling meow that somehow echoed, like it was bouncing off walls I couldn't see. And then it spoke. "You are late," it said. The voice didn't come from its mouth. It was just there, vibrating in my chest. I froze, my brain rejecting what was happening. Cats don't talk. Cats don't talk. Late for what? I croaked. The other 2 cats moved, circling around me until I was boxed in. "Follow," the middle cat said. It turned and began walking toward the crosswalk, its glowing eyes leading the way. The other 2 cats waited, staring at me expectantly, like bodyguards ensuring I didn't run. I considered running anyway, but where was I going to go? The city was gone, swallowed by the dark. I couldn't even see the buildings anymore, only endless black stretching out in every direction. So, like an idiot, I followed the cats. We crossed the street, their paw steps impossibly silent. As I walked, the ground beneath me changed. The smooth pavement gave way to cobblestones, uneven and damp. I looked down and realized I wasn't on the street anymore. I was walking through an old alley, the kind you see in European cities, narrow and lit by faint gas lamps flickering in the gloom. The cats led me to a heavy wooden door set into the brick wall. The middle cat sat in front of it and looked up at me. "Open it." I stared at the door, then at the cat. "With what? It doesn't even have a handle." The cat blinked, slow and patient. "It will open for you." I pressed my hand against the wood, not expecting anything to happen, but the door groaned and swung inward on its own. Beyond it was not an alley or a room. It was a forest. Trees with silver bark stretched endlessly upward, their leaves glowing faintly like they were dusted with starlight. A mist curled along the ground, swirling around my ankles as I stepped inside. "What is this place?" I whispered. "The Between," said the cat. It padded inside, followed by the others. "A place that exists outside of where you came from, and outside of where you're going." "Why am I here?" I asked. The cat sat on its haunches and looked at me. "Because you were chosen." "Chosen for what?" Before the cat could answer, a sound split the air, like the groan of an ancient door opening, but layered with a low growl that made my bones vibrate. The cats all went still, their eyes snapping to the trees. "Time is short," the middle cat said, its voice sharp now. "If you want to leave, you must find the key." "What key? What does it look like?" I was panicking, spinning in place as the mist thickened and that growl grew louder, closer. "You will know it when you see it," the cat said. "Run, run, run." I didn't ask questions. I bolted into the forest, my shoes slipping on the damp earth. The growl behind me turned into a roar, something massive crashing through the trees. I couldn't see it, only shadows, flickering and huge, moving impossibly fast through the mist. Ahead, I saw a faint glow. I ran toward it, lungs burning, heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. The glow grew brighter until I stumbled into a small clearing. In the center, sitting on a tree stump, was a key. It didn't look like a key to anything, twisted and silver, shaped like roots tangled together. I didn't care. I grabbed it. The ground trembled. The roar behind me grew deafening, so close I could feel the heat of its breath. I squeezed the key, and suddenly everything went still. I blinked. I was standing in the crosswalk again. The streetlights were on, the city buzzing with normal life. Cars rolled past me, and the rain had stopped. The cats were gone. My hand was empty. No key, no silver forest, nothing. I stumbled to the sidewalk, gasping like I'd run a marathon. People walked past me without a glance, as if I hadn't just disappeared into a pocket dimension chased by some shadow monster. But as I caught my breath, I saw it. A black cat sitting across the street, staring at me. Its yellow eyes glowed faintly. It blinked once, slow and deliberate, before slinking into the shadows. I never saw it again, but sometimes, when I'm alone, I'll catch a glimpse of silver mist curling around my ankles. Have you ever felt like you walked into a moment you weren't supposed to find, but couldn't escape? The snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes, blanketing the forest in silence. In the center of the clearing stood the cabin, its wood weathered and dark, its chimney releasing a single curl of smoke that disappeared into the endless white sky. The world seemed frozen in time, a painting rather than a place. And yet, inside, a clock ticked. Rin sat by the fire, cradling a chipped mug of tea that had long since gone cold. She hadn't touched it in hours, her eyes fixed instead on the object sitting on the table in front of her. A leather-bound book, its spine cracked and worn. It was locked, the brass clasp tarnished with age, and no key accompanied it. It had appeared on her doorstep that morning, wrapped in brown paper with no return address. There were no footprints in the snow leading to or from the cabin. She should have left it outside, ignored it. But something about it had drawn her in, an itch in her brain she couldn't scratch. Now it sat between her and the silence, daring her. She hadn't dared open it, not yet. The book exuded a heaviness that wasn't physical but felt real all the same, as though its presence bent the air around it. She didn't know how she knew, but she was certain that opening it would change everything. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. Rin pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, her breath fogging in the cold air of the room. She hadn't lit the fire herself. It had already been burning when she woke, crackling merrily as though someone else had been here before her. Someone, or something. She reached for the book, her fingers hovering over the clasp. Her heart hammered in her chest, the kind of adrenaline spike she hadn't felt since the night she left the city, fleeing a life she didn't want to remember. Just as her fingers brushed the leather, there was a knock at the door. The sound was jarring, impossibly loud in the stillness of the cabin. Rin froze, her eyes darting to the door. No one came out here. Not her family, not her former friends, not even the occasional hunter. She had made sure of it. The knock came again. 3 measured raps, steady as a heartbeat. "Who's there?" she called, her voice thin, trembling. No answer. She set the mug down and stood, her body tense. Her hand went to the fireplace poker leaning against the hearth, and she gripped it tightly as she approached the door. The knocking stopped. Rin hesitated, then pulled the door open. No one was there. Only the forest greeted her, its branches swaying under the weight of snow. But there, at the edge of the clearing, she saw it, a figure. Tall and cloaked, its face hidden beneath a hood. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, waiting. Rin's breath quickened. "Hello," she called out. The figure raised an arm, its hand pointing toward her, toward the cabin. No, she realized, not the cabin, toward the book. She stepped back inside, slamming the door shut and bolting it. The figure didn't follow. She peered out through the frosted window, but the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. The fire flared behind her, a sudden burst of heat and light. Rin spun around, the poker raised. The book was glowing now, faintly, the brass clasp shimmering like it had just been polished. She approached it slowly, her heartbeat loud in her ears. The warmth from the fire felt oppressive now, too much for the small room. The book seemed alive, the leather pulsating faintly, like it was breathing. Rin sat down and stared at it. The figure in the woods hadn't scared her, not really. But this book, terrified her. It had an aura of inevitability, like a decision she'd already made but didn't want to face. Her fingers found the clasp again, trembling but resolute. She pressed it down, and with a soft click, the lock released. The book fell open. At first, the pages were blank. She flipped through them, confused, her fear slowly giving way to frustration. "What are you?" she muttered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Then, as she turned to the last page, the words appeared. "I see you, Ren. I've always seen you." Her blood ran cold. She dropped the book, but the words remained etched into her mind. The fire dimmed, the room darkening, and for a moment, she thought she heard something, whispering, faint and insistent, just on the edge of comprehension. She didn't want to look back at the book, but she couldn't help herself. The words were gone now, replaced by something new. "Come outside." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, no, no." The wind howled louder, shaking the cabin, and then the whispers grew louder, insistent, rising to a crescendo that drowned out every other sound. The door rattled in its frame, and the fire guttered, plunging the room into near darkness. And then, silence. Rin turned toward the door, her breath catching in her throat. The handle was turning. "No," she said again, backing away, her voice cracking. "Stay out." The door creaked open, and cold air rushed in, extinguishing the fire completely. The figure stepped inside, its cloak brushing the floor. It stopped just inside the threshold, the shadows clinging to it like oil. "Ran," it said, its voice low and reverberating. "You opened it." She couldn't speak, couldn't move. The figure reached into its cloak and pulled out something small and dark. A key, ancient and intricately carved. "This is yours now," it said, holding the key out to her. "What does it open?" she managed to choke out. The figure tilted its head. "The next door." Rin didn't take the key. "I don't want it." "One has nothing to do with it," the figure said, its voice almost gentle. "You chose this when you opened the book." The key floated toward her, hovering in the air until it landed in her trembling hand. The figure stepped back, merging with the shadows until it disappeared entirely. The fire roared back to life, brighter and hotter than before. The book closed itself, the clasp snapping shut, and Run felt the weight of the key in her palm like a stone. She knew, deep down, that she would never be alone again. When I woke up this morning, my reflection was already staring at me. Not staring in the normal, blurry-eyed, "Oh God, it's Monday" way. No, it was leaning forward, nose practically pressed to the other side of the mirror, with a smug little grin that I definitely wasn't making. "Well," it said, in my voice, but with none of my morning grogginess. "Look who finally decided to wake up." I froze. Did you just talk?" "Wow, sharp as ever," it said, rolling my eyes in a way I'd never perfected. "I've been waiting years for this, and this is the energy you're bringing to the table?" "Years," I repeated, staring at my reflection, which was now casually leaning against the frame of the mirror like it had nowhere better to be. "What does that even mean?" "You're me." "Sort of," it said with a shrug. "Mirror me. Other you. Call it what you want. The point is, I've got opinions, and now you can finally hear them." "Opinions?" I asked, still trying to process the fact that my reflection was more caffeinated than I was. "Let's start with the hair," it said, gesturing to the bird's nest on my head. "What's the plan here? Are we aiming for eccentric artist, or human tumbleweed?" "I'm sorry," I started, but my reflection cut me off. "You should be," it said, "because whatever this is, it's not working." Before I could respond, I heard a low, gravelly voice coming from the corner of the room. "Is she finally awake?" it muttered. I turned to find my closet door ajar, clothes shifting faintly inside. A pair of jeans draped over a hanger leaned forward, creaking slightly. "It's been hours," the jeans said. "We've been arguing all morning about whether you'd pick me, Or those awful leggings again? What? I spluttered, looking between the closet and the mirror. I'm voting for me, obviously, said a blazer, its voice clipped and British. She needs to stop dressing like she's late for gym class. The leggings, slumped on the floor, let out an offended huff. Gym class? I'm comfortable. I breathe. What do you do, stuffy jacket? Make her sweat in interviews? Oh, please, the blazer snapped. You're barely holding it together. Look at those threads. I backed out of the room before my wardrobe could stage a full-on intervention. Where do you think you're going? The mirror called after me. We're not done here. The hallway wasn't any quieter. The floorboards creaked indignantly under my feet. Light step, they groaned. Maybe try slippers, the rug suggested. Or socks. Honestly, it's like you want splinters. By the time I made it to the kitchen, I was already questioning every life choice that had led me to this moment. But the kitchen, it seemed, had been waiting for me. The coffee machine perked up immediately. Oh, there she is. Took you long enough. Finally, said the kettle, letting out a low whistle. I've been sitting here useless for weeks. Why don't you ever make tea anymore? The toaster, glowing faintly from the last round of bread I'd burned the day before, added, She's just going to eat cereal again. Watch. No respect for the classics. I ignored them all, grabbing a bowl from the cabinet. Cereal! The bowl cheered, its voice bright and excitable, like a game show host. The spoon groaned as I picked it up. Not again, it said. You know what happens to me. Milk crust. Every time. At this point, I was teetering between fascination and a mental breakdown. My kitchen appliances had opinions, my wardrobe was staging a rebellion, and my own reflection was giving me side-eye. Then Juniper strolled in. Juniper, my cat, who usually communicated exclusively in yowls and disdain, hopped onto the counter with a grace I could never hope to match. She sat down primly, tail wrapping around her paws, and looked me dead in the eye. Took you long enough, she said, her voice smooth and low, like a jazz singer in a smoky club. You can talk to? I asked, my voice rising several octaves. I've always talked, she said, flicking an ear dismissively. You just never bothered to listen. Classic human behavior. Okay, no, I said, pointing an accusatory finger at her. This is not normal. What's happening to me? You're waking up, she replied, as though that explained anything. Waking up to what? To the fact that everything around you has a voice, she said. Objects, furniture, appliances, us. It's all alive. It's all aware. You're just finally in tune with it. I stared at her, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or reach for the nearest bottle of wine. Don't bother, the wine rack piped up from the corner. You finished the last bottle last Thursday, remember? I do. Juniper continued, ignoring the interruption. You'll get used to it, she said. Honestly, it's about time. The toaster's been dying to tell you to stop shoving oversized bagels in it. I heard that, the toaster shouted. The rest of the day was a blur of unsolicited advice and non-stop commentary. My showerhead critiqued my water temperature preferences. The dishwasher demanded a better rinse cycle. Even my phone chimed in, complaining about how I never clear my notifications. By evening, I was exhausted. As I collapsed onto the couch, it let out an exaggerated sigh. Another day, another but print, it said. Seriously, why don't you ever sit in the armchair? I like the couch, I muttered. That's not the point, it snapped. Spread the love. The armchair's lonely. I am not, called the armchair from across the room. Juniper hopped onto my lap, purring softly. See, she said, her voice tinged with amusement. You survived. Not so bad, right? Not so bad? I asked, running a hand through my hair. My entire house is judging me. My pants are judging me. How am I supposed to live like this? Juniper yawned, stretching lazily. You're supposed to listen, she said. Maybe they're not wrong. I stared at her, then at the ceiling, which was now murmuring about cobwebs. What if she was right? What if everything I ignored, the clutter, the wear and tear, the little voices in my head and outside of it, had been trying to tell me something all along. So, if your world suddenly came alive, if your reflection called you out, your fridge gave you life advice, and your couch got passive-aggressive, would you listen? Or would you drown it out and pretend it was all in your head? Because me? I think I'm starting to hear them more clearly every day. So, here's the thing. Every time I fall for someone, I develop a completely irrational and uncontrollable superpower. At least, that's what I call it, though it's less save the world and more. What the heck is happening to me right now? I don't know how or why it happens, but the moment I start liking someone, my body, or maybe the universe itself, decides it's time to level up. Not in a cool, superhero way, but in a what is my life now way. It's like my crush unlocks some bizarre new ability that I absolutely do not need or want. The first time it happened, I was 16, and I had a crush on my best friend's brother, Evan. He was older, effortlessly charming, and had the kind of laugh that made you feel like you were part of an inside joke. The only problem was, I'd never even spoken a full sentence to him because every time he looked at me, my brain dissolved into static. Anyway, one day, I was over at my friend's house, and Evan walked into the kitchen to grab something from the fridge. I was trying to play it cool, but the second he said, "Hey," my heart started racing, and then I sneezed. Except it wasn't a normal sneeze. When I opened my eyes, the light bulb above us had exploded. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. Old light bulbs blow out all the time, right? But then, it happened again. This time in my own house. I was thinking about him while brushing my hair in front of the bathroom mirror, and out of nowhere, the ceiling fan started spinning so fast it literally unscrewed itself and fell to the floor. That's when I realized. My emotions were somehow short-circuiting the electricity around me. Every time I thought about Evan, I'd fry something, a light, an outlet, even my mom's hairdryer once. My parents were convinced we had faulty wiring, but I knew the truth. My crush was a fire hazard. That should have been the end of it, right? Like a one-time, weird teenage fluke. But no. The next time I developed feelings for someone, a whole new ability appeared. I was in college, and there was this girl in my theater class, Jamie. She had the coolest, raspiest voice, like she'd spent her entire life narrating noir films. I was completely smitten. I couldn't stop staring at her during rehearsals, which was already bad enough. But then, the echoes started. Yeah, echoes. As in, every time Jamie said something, I'd hear it twice. Once in real time, and then again, a second later, bouncing around in my head like a ghost was replaying her words on loop. It wasn't just her voice either. The first time we hung out in a group setting, I could swear I was hearing her thoughts. At one point, she was sitting next to me, looking at her phone, and I heard her say, clear as day, "Ugh, I forgot to charge it." But when I turned to respond, her lips weren't moving. She hadn't said anything aloud. I spent the rest of the night pretending to scroll through Instagram while quietly panicking. Was I psychic now? Was Jamie broadcasting her thoughts into my brain? Was this just what love felt like? To this day, I have no idea if I was actually hearing her thoughts or just losing my grip on reality, but I eventually stopped crushing on her, and the echoes went away. Then there was the time I had a crush on my coworker, Luke, and developed the ability to smell his emotions. Yep, you read that right. I was working at a summer internship, and Luke was one of those guys who's effortlessly good at everything. Charming with the clients, brilliant at presentations, and just shy enough to seem approachable. Naturally, I fell for him immediately. And naturally, my body responded by giving me the worst superpower imaginable. The first time it happened, we were sitting in a meeting, and I suddenly smelled mint, like overwhelmingly minty toothpaste. It was so strong I thought someone had spilled an entire bottle of mouthwash. Then I noticed Luke was shifting in his seat, looking nervous as our boss grilled him on some report. That's when it clicked. The minty smell wasn't real. It was Luke's nervousness. Over the next few weeks, I started associating certain emotions with specific scents. Happiness smelled like oranges. Frustration? Burnt toast. The worst was when he was stressed. It smelled like wet socks left in a gym bag. I couldn't figure out if this was some strange sixth sense, or if I was just inventing things because I was hyper-aware of him. Either way, I started carrying around gum and essential oils just to mask the sensory overload. You'd think I'd learned to keep my emotions in check, but no. My last and weirdest crush power happened just a few months ago. I just moved into a new apartment, and my upstairs neighbor, Sam, had this way of smiling like he knew a secret. I'd bump into him in the elevator or the laundry room, and he'd always flash me that grin, like we were in on some unspoken joke. I started imagining what it would be like to ask him out, and that's when things got surreal. I woke up one morning, opened my fridge, and found a carton of milk with Sam's name written on it in Sharpie. I don't know how it got there. I definitely didn't buy it, but I brushed it off as a weird prank. Then, over the next week, random objects in my apartment started changing. My favorite mug now had his initials on the side. A book I'd been reading suddenly had a sticky note inside with "Return to Sam" scrawled on it. Even my TV remote had a label that said, "Sam's property." It was like the universe was trying to merge our lives together, one object at a time. I ended up switching grocery stores just to avoid running into him because I couldn't handle the constant reminders. So yeah, that's my little quirk. Every time I like someone, the laws of nature bend just enough to make me question my sanity. I don't know if it's the universe trying to help me, or if it's trying to get me to stay single forever, but one thing's for sure. I've stopped taking crushes lightly. What about you? Do you have any weird, unexplainable habits or strange experiences when it comes to falling for someone? Or is it just me, accidentally rewriting reality every time I catch feelings? The train station wasn't on any map. At least, none that I've ever found. I was 15 the first time I stumbled across it, on a cool autumn evening when the world felt heavy with the kind of silence that happens after the wind stops blowing. I'd been out later than usual, wandering farther than I should have, trying to shake the restless itch that had been crawling under my skin all day. The sun had already sunk below the hills, and the only light came from the pale glow of the moon. I just turned down a narrow path I didn't recognize, expecting it to lead back to the main road, when I saw it. A small wooden sign, barely visible in the dusk, with the word "Haven" painted in neat white letters. The path curved sharply ahead, and for a moment, I hesitated. Something about it felt off, but not in a bad way. More like I wasn't supposed to be there. Which, of course, made me want to keep going. The path opened into a clearing, and there it was, a tiny train station, tucked into the woods like it had grown there. The platform was made of dark, polished wood, and the building itself was small and cozy, with warm yellow light spilling from its windows. A sign hung above the door, matching the one I'd seen on the path. Haven Station. There were no tracks. That was the first thing I noticed. No metal rails stretching off into the distance. No gravel bed. No sign that trains ever came through here. And yet, as I stepped onto the platform, I heard it. The faint, far-off whistle of an approaching engine. I waited, heart pounding, as the sound grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic ch-ch-ch of wheels on invisible tracks. And then it appeared. The train shimmered into view as if it were stepping out of a dream. Its sleek, silver cars gleamed in the moonlight, and its windows glowed faintly, though I couldn't see inside. It didn't slow down so much as come to a stop all at once, perfectly still, perfectly silent, as if it had always been there. The door to the nearest car slid open with a soft hiss. Inside was a conductor, dressed in a crisp uniform that looked a little old-fashioned, with a cap tilted just so. His eyes were sharp, and his face was kind, but there was something in his expression that made me feel like he could see right through me. "You're early," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "Early for what?" I asked, though the words caught in my throat. "For your stop," he said, smiling faintly. "But that's all right. We're not on a strict schedule. What kind of train is this?" I blurted. "Where does it go?" The conductor tipped his head toward the open door. "Where do you want to go?" I hesitated, glancing back at the path I'd come from. Part of me knew I should leave, that stepping onto that train might mean never stepping off again. But another part of me, the part that had always been drawn to strange places and unanswered questions, was already moving forward. The train car was warm and quiet, filled with soft leather seats and small, brass lamps that cast a gentle glow. It smelled faintly of cedar and something sweet, like fresh-baked cookies. I sat by a window, though there was nothing to see outside but darkness. The conductor didn't ask for a ticket. He simply nodded and moved to the next car, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the train. I sat there for what felt like hours, or maybe minutes. Time didn't seem to matter, watching the faint reflections of the lamps flicker against the window. And then, slowly, the darkness outside began to shift. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but soon I could make out shapes. Rolling hills, wide rivers, forests that seemed impossibly dense. It wasn't the landscape that struck me, though. It was the way it felt. Familiar, somehow, like I'd seen it before, though I knew I hadn't. It was like looking at a memory I didn't know I had. The train slowed as it approached the first stop, a small station perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking the ocean. The water sparkled under a sky filled with unfamiliar constellations. A woman stepped onto the platform, her arms filled with wildflowers, and boarded the train without a word. She nodded to me as she passed, her eyes glinting like she knew something I didn't. The second stop was in the middle of a sprawling desert, where the sand shimmered with hues of gold and violet. A man in a long coat and wide-brimmed hat climbed aboard, carrying a satchel that seemed far too heavy for its size. He sat a few rows behind me, humming softly to himself. Each stop brought new passengers, but none of them spoke to me, and I didn't ask where they were going. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Finally, the conductor returned, his footsteps soft against the carpeted floor. He stopped beside my seat, his sharp eyes studying me for a moment before he spoke. "You've been quiet," he said. "Most people ask questions by now." "I don't know what to ask," I admitted. He nodded, as if he'd expected that. "You've got a choice to make," he said, gesturing toward the window. "Every passenger does." I glanced outside, and my breath caught in my throat. The train was passing through a city now, but it wasn't like any city I'd ever seen. The buildings were tall and angular, their windows glowing with soft, golden light. People walked the streets below, their laughter and chatter faint but clear, like music drifting through the air. It wasn't the city itself that stopped me, though. It was the faces. Among the crowd, I saw people I knew. My best friend from 3rd grade, who'd moved away years ago. My grandmother, who'd passed when I was 7. Even my dog, Sparky, wagging his tail happily as he trotted beside a man in a gray coat. "This is where you're from," the conductor said, his voice low and even. "The pieces you've left behind." "And what's on the other side?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know. "The pieces you haven't found yet." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "What happens if I stay?" He smiled, that same faint, knowing smile. "You go back. You live your life. You'll remember this, but only in bits and pieces, like a dream you can't quite hold on to. And if I go forward?" His eyes softened. "You'll find the rest of your story." The train began to slow, the wheels hissing softly against the invisible tracks. Outside, the city faded into mist, and beyond it, I could just make out the edge of something bright, too bright to look at directly. The conductor held out his hand. "It's your choice." I still don't know how long I sat there, staring at that light, the weight of his words pressing against me. In the end, I made my choice, but I'll let you decide what it was. After all, it's your train now. Where would you go? Not the stale kind you get from peeling one on the subway or the sharp tang from a bottle of hand soap. This was richer, deeper, like someone had plucked the essence of summer afternoons and bottled it up. I was walking home from work, late, of course, my footsteps echoing through the empty streets when the scent hit me. It came out of nowhere, and it stopped me cold. That was the first strange thing. The second strange thing was the lamppost. It was just a regular lamppost at first glance, standing at the corner where Ashbury meets 11th. I must have walked past it hundreds of times, but tonight, I noticed something odd. At its base, there was a door. A tiny one. It couldn't have been more than 3 feet tall, framed in green wood, with a brass knob and an intricate carving of vines twisting around its edges. I blinked, sure I was imagining it, but when I knelt down for a closer look, it was still there. The brass handle glinted faintly in the lamplight, as though it was waiting for someone to touch it. I glanced around, but the street was empty, quiet. Just me, the lamppost, and the inexplicable smell of oranges. Okay, I murmured, half laughing to myself. What the hell? I reached for the knob. The door opened. The first thing I noticed was the light, soft and golden, spilling through the doorway as though I'd opened a portal to somewhere else entirely. The second thing I noticed was the music. It was faint, but I could hear it. A lilting melody played on strings, distant and lovely, like something you'd hear in a dream. Without thinking, I ducked my head and stepped through, and the world changed. The street disappeared behind me, swallowed whole. I was standing in a forest. Not the dark, damp kind you'd expect to find on a camping trip, but something out of a painting. The trees were massive, their trunks wide enough to build houses in, and their leaves glowed faintly, silver and gold. Above me, the sky was a dusky purple, streaked with ribbons of pale green light, like the northern lights had decided to come closer for a better look. I turned in slow circles, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. The air was warm, filled with the scent of oranges and something else, something floral and spicy that tugged at my memory. "That's new," a voice said. I jumped and spun around, heart in my throat. A man sat cross-legged on the branch of a tree, about 10 feet up, as casual as if it were a park bench. He had wild, dark hair and wore clothes that looked like they were stitched together from leaves and shadows. His eyes, though, that's what got me. They were the color of storm clouds, flickering faintly with light when he blinked. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, though he didn't seem particularly bothered by it. "Well, not yet, anyway." "Where is here?" I managed to ask. He tilted his head, grinning like I just asked the funniest question in the world. "Depends who's asking." I was about to tell him that I was asking when something darted past me, a streak of silver light, so fast it was gone before I could react. The man in the tree sighed dramatically. "They're always in such a hurry." What was that? A messenger. They're harmless unless you owe them something. I don't owe them anything. His grin sharpened. "Not yet." I stared up at him, trying to decide whether or not to run. "Look, I don't know how I got here. I found this door in a lamppost." "Ah," he said, hopping down from the branch without so much as a sound. He landed a few feet from me, close enough that I could see faint golden tattoos curling up his arms like ivy. The lamppost door. Always taking people who were just curious enough to ruin their own lives. "Ruin?" I echoed. He shrugged. "Or improve. Depends on what you do next." Before I could ask him what that meant, the music I'd heard earlier grew louder. It was coming from deeper in the forest, faint notes drifting toward us on the warm breeze. My chest tightened inexplicably, like the sound was tied to some invisible thread pulling me forward. The man watched me carefully, his storm cloud eyes narrowing slightly. "You hear it, don't you?" I nodded. "That's rare," he said, almost to himself. "You must be chosen." "Chosen for what?" But he just shook his head, his grin gone. "Don't follow it. Not yet." "Why not?" "Because they'll know you're here," he said simply. "And once they know, they'll find you." I opened my mouth to argue, to demand answers. But he had already turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving me alone with the sound of the music and the glowing, golden forest stretching endlessly before me. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the music. Maybe it was the smell of oranges still clinging to the air. Or maybe it was just the same curiosity that had brought me this far. But I took a step forward, and then another. The deeper I went, the louder the music grew, and the trees began to change. Their trunks grew darker, their leaves turning to deep, inky black, though they still glowed faintly like embers in the dark. The light in the sky dimmed, and shadows stretched unnaturally long across the path. And then I saw them, figures standing in the trees. They were tall and thin, with elongated limbs and faces that were blank except for the faintest hint of features, as though someone had started carving them and never finished. They didn't move. They just watched. The music swelled. I should have turned around. I wanted to turn around, but when I looked back, the path behind me was gone, swallowed up by the dark. Ahead, the music grew louder still, and through the trees, I saw a clearing bathed in silver light. At its center stood a massive tree, its branches spiraling out like the veins of the sky itself. At its base was a door, taller than me and made of the same green wood as the one I'd found in the lamppost. And standing beside it was me, or at least something that looked like me. She tilted her head and smiled. A smile just a little too wide, her eyes just a little too dark. She raised one hand and beckoned. "Come on," she said, her voice echoing strangely, like it was layered with other voices. "It's almost time." I don't know what stopped me, some primal instinct, some deeply buried warning, but I didn't move. My doppelganger's smile faltered. The music stuttered, the figures in the trees leaning forward just slightly, as though waiting. I stepped back. The world shivered, and then I ran. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling back through the tiny door in the lamppost, collapsing onto the pavement outside my building, gasping for breath. The door was gone. The smell of oranges had vanished. But my reflection in the window of a parked car looked at me just a second too late when I turned away. Have you ever felt like something was watching you just beyond the edge of your vision? Like the world you know is only holding itself together by the thinnest thread? I didn't know where we were going, which is a risky premise for a first date. The only instructions he'd given me were to wear comfy shoes, bring a jacket, and keep an open mind. I'd nearly bailed twice because, honestly, who has the energy for cryptic plans from someone they barely know? But there was something about his text, casual but curious, like he wanted to see if I'd play along, that made me decide to show up. He was waiting for me at the corner of an old brick building, the kind of place that's been there so long it seems like it belongs to a different decade. He had a backpack slung over one shoulder, and this slightly lopsided grin that made him look more mischievous than confident. "You came," he said, as if he were genuinely surprised. "Figured I'd see what all the mystery's about," I replied, hands tucked into my jacket pockets to ward off the chilly evening air. "Well, I hope you're ready, because tonight's going to be unconventional," he said, motioning for me to follow. We walked a few blocks, making small talk as the city buzzed around us. Then, he stopped in front of an unremarkable metal door tucked between two graffiti-covered walls. No sign, no indication of what lay beyond. He knocked twice, paused, and knocked once more. The door creaked open, and a guy with a beard so massive it looked like it was trying to eat his face nodded us inside without a word. "What is this?" I whispered as we stepped into a narrow, dimly lit hallway that smelled faintly of wood and incense. "You'll see," he said, clearly relishing the suspense. The hallway opened into a cavernous room that felt like stepping into a secret society's meeting place. The walls were lined with shelves crammed full of oddities. Old books with frayed covers, globes missing chunks of their maps, jars filled with things I couldn't identify but definitely wouldn't touch. In the center of the room, clusters of people were gathered around tables, each one covered in strange contraptions, tiny mechanical models, clockwork animals, and glittering puzzles. "This," he said, gesturing like a game show host revealing a prize, "is the Curiosity Club." I blinked at him, waiting for an explanation. "It's this sort of underground gathering. People come here to work on weird projects, solve riddles, or just, I don't know, tinker with things. There's a secret theme every week. Tonight, it's all about contraptions." I had about a million questions, but he was already pulling me toward one of the tables. "Come on, we're late," he said, like this was the most normal thing in the world. We ended up at a table where a small group was working on what appeared to be a Rube Goldberg machine made entirely of junk. There was a spoon taped to a wire, a tiny toy car, a precariously balanced row of dominoes, and a contraption made out of rubber bands that looked like it was barely holding itself together. The goal? To make the final step launch a ping-pong ball into a tiny bucket across the table. "Okay," he said, rubbing his hands together. "Time to get creative. You in?" I hesitated, still trying to wrap my head around this whole scene. But there was something infectious about his enthusiasm, like he genuinely didn't care if this was silly or strange. He was just here to have fun. So, I shrugged and said, "Why not?" The next hour was pure chaos. We debated the physics of using a yo-yo as a counterweight, argued over whether or not duct tape was cheating, and nearly toppled the entire machine 3 separate times. At one point, He leaned in close, holding a paperclip like it was the solution to all our problems, and whispered, "I think this is the missing piece of the puzzle." "It's a paperclip," I said, laughing. "This isn't MacGyver." "Don't underestimate the power of a paperclip," he replied, completely straight-faced. When the machine finally worked, after a dozen failed attempts and a lot of cheering from the other tables, it felt like we'd won a championship. The tiny ping-pong ball soared across the table and landed perfectly in the bucket, and for a split second, everyone around us burst into applause. I looked over at him, his grin wide and boyish, and thought, who was this guy? Afterward, we wandered outside, the city feeling quieter now that the night had settled in. "So," he said, swinging his backpack over his shoulder, "was this the weirdest first date you've ever been on?" "Absolutely," I said, "but also one of the best." He stopped walking, turning to face me with a curious expression. "Why?" I thought about it for a moment. Because it wasn't about trying to impress me. It was just you, being completely yourself. And because, I added with a smirk, we absolutely crushed that machine. "You know," he said, stepping a little closer, "there's one last part of the night." "Oh no," I said, mock groaning. "What now? Do I have to solve a riddle to get home?" "Not quite." He pulled something out of his bag and handed it to me. A small, intricately folded piece of paper. "It's a challenge. Open it when you get home." I raised an eyebrow. "A challenge?" "Just trust me," he said, and for the second time that night, I decided to play along. When I got home, I unfolded the paper. Inside was a handwritten note. "Build something with no purpose except to make you smile. Send me a picture when you do." I laughed out loud, shaking my head at his ridiculousness. But as I set the paper down, I found myself thinking about what I'd build and how, for the first time in a long time, I couldn't wait for a second date. Have you ever had a date so strange and wonderful that it made you see the world a little differently? The first time I met Cass, she was stealing flowers from my garden. I just finished dinner and stepped outside to water my plants when I saw her crouched over the hydrangeas, snipping away with a pair of scissors that gleamed in the moonlight. At first, I thought she was a raccoon. My eyesight isn't great. But then she stood up, tall and bold, holding a fistful of blossoms like a victorious knight returning from battle. "Can I help you?" I asked, more bewildered than angry. She froze, then turned to face me, completely unbothered by the fact that she'd just been caught red-handed. "These are for my aunt," she said matter-of-factly, as if that explained everything. I stared at her. She stared back. She looked like the kind of person who'd use the phrase chaotic neutral to describe themselves. Wild hair, mismatched clothes, a glint in her eye that suggested she lived her life entirely off script. "You know," I said, pointing at the flowers in her hand, "there's this place called a florist. You pay money, and they give you flowers. Revolutionary concept." She grinned, completely unfazed. "Florists are for people who don't like adventure." "Adventure?" I repeated, incredulous. "You're trespassing." She shrugged. "Tomato, tomato." Then she tucked the flowers under her arm, like she was carrying a bouquet of swords, and said, "I'll pay you back. Probably. Thanks for your service to the cause." Before I could say another word, she hopped the fence and disappeared into the night. For a while, I thought that was the end of it. A weird encounter to tell my friends about. Nothing more. But then, 2 days later, I found a mason jar of wildflowers sitting on my porch, along with a note scrawled in loopy handwriting. "Your hydrangeas saved the day. Aunt Marge sends her thanks. P.S. You have terrible soil. Mulch is your friend." I didn't know whether to be annoyed or amused. I settled on amused, mostly because I couldn't stop picturing this strange, flower-stealing girl lecturing me about gardening like she was some kind of botanical Robin Hood. The next time I saw her, it was entirely by accident. I was at the park, trying to read a book, when I heard someone arguing with a goose. Not yelling or shooing it away, arguing. "Listen, buddy," a familiar voice said. "I know you think this pond is your territory, but I'm just here to sketch the willow tree. No need to get violent." Sure enough, it was her, Cass, sitting cross-legged by the edge of the pond, a sketch pad balanced on her knees and a very angry goose honking in her face. You again, I said before I could stop myself. She looked up, squinting at me like she was trying to place my face. Oh hey, hydrangea guy. It's Jake, I said. And you're the thief who lectures people about mulch. She grinned, completely unrepentant. Guilty. What brings you to Gooseville? Trying to read, I said, holding up my book. You? Trying not to get murdered by this goose? I glanced at the goose, which was now pacing menacingly back and forth. What did you do to it? Nothing, she said, offended. Geese are just inherently hostile. They're like the mob bosses of the bird world. I didn't know why, but I laughed. An actual, full-on laugh. The kind that sneaks up on you when you're not expecting it. That was the start of whatever this thing between us was. Friendship? Rivalry? Chaos magnetism? I'm still not sure. All I know is that Cass kept popping up in my life like a particularly mischievous dandelion, and every time, she managed to pull me into her orbit. One time, she showed up at my door with a bucket of worms and declared that we were starting a compost bin. Another time, she convinced me to sneak into an abandoned greenhouse on the edge of town because, according to her, it was full of secrets. It wasn't. It was full of cobwebs and one very startled raccoon. But for all her chaos, Cass had a way of making the world feel bigger. She noticed things most people didn't. Tiny mushrooms growing in the cracks of the sidewalk, the way the light filtered through stained glass windows, the songs crickets sang on summer nights. Being around her felt like stepping into a fairy tale where everything, even the mundane, had a spark of magic. One evening, as we sat in my backyard watching the fireflies blink in and out, I asked her, "Why do you do it? The trespassing, the sneaking around, the weird adventures. What's the point?" She was quiet for a moment, staring up at the stars. Then she said, "I guess I just like finding the things people overlook. The tiny, wild, beautiful things no one bothers to notice. It's like, if I don't pay attention, who will?" For once, I didn't have a snarky reply. Over time, Cass became more than just the girl who stole my hydrangeas. She became the person who dragged me out of my comfort zone, who reminded me that there's more to life than deadlines and routines. She taught me how to grow tomatoes, how to whistle through a blade of grass, how to see the world through her particular brand of chaotic wonder. And somewhere along the way, I realized I didn't just like her. I was falling for her. The last time I saw Cass, she left a bundle of lavender tied with twine on my porch, along with a note that said, "Gone chasing wildflowers. Don't forget to mulch." She comes and goes like that. A breeze that stirs up your life and then slips away before you can catch it. But every time I see a wildflower or hear the rustle of leaves in the wind, I think of her and smile. Have you ever met someone who blew into your life like a storm and left it brighter than before? When I woke up, the sky was upside down. It wasn't just flipped like a reflection in a still lake. It was wrong in ways I couldn't put into words. The clouds moved backward, curling in on themselves like spilled ink, and the sun hung low and fractured, as though it were being refracted through a shattered prism. It painted the world in shards of rainbow light that glimmered on surfaces that didn't seem to have existed before. The first clue that something was deeply off was my coffee table. It had sprouted legs. Not short, squat legs like a dog or a cat, but long, spindly, insect-like ones that clicked on the hardwood floor as it paced nervously. "Finally," it said when it noticed me staring, its tone clipped and impatient. "I was beginning to think you'd sleep through it. Do you have any idea what kind of day we're about to have?" I blinked at it, my brain scrambling to find an appropriate response. No. "Of course you don't," it said with a dramatic huff, its legs folding neatly beneath it. "They never tell the humans anything." Typical. I sat up, gripping the edge of my bed for stability. My body felt heavier than usual, like gravity had doubled overnight. "Okay," I said slowly, "why is my coffee table talking? And why does it have legs? And why does the sky look like that?" The table clicked its mandibles, I realized with growing unease, and said, "The shuffle started." Obviously. What shuffle? The Great Realm Shuffle. The big one. The event of the millennium, give or take a few centuries. Your reality and a few others have been reconfigured. Temporarily, of course. Think of it like a house party, but with dimensions instead of people. I stared at it, trying to process what it had just said. You're telling me my reality has been thrown into some kind of cosmic mixer? Exactly, it said, its voice brightening. Finally, you're catching on. Now, get dressed. You're going to need shoes. Why? Because the floor's mad at you. Before I could ask what that meant, the hardwood beneath my feet groaned, and a deep, rumbling voice filled the room. Do you know how many crumbs you've dropped on me? Do you? I've been so patient, and this is how you repay me. I scrambled to my feet as the floor buckled and rippled beneath me like a restless ocean. Apologize, hissed the coffee table, its legs clicking nervously. Do it quickly. I'm sorry, I yelped, my arms flailing for balance. I'll clean up. I'll, get a Swiffer or something. The floor grumbled for a moment longer before settling with an irritated creak. See that you do, it muttered. What the hell is happening? I asked, turning to the coffee table. But before it could answer, my bedroom door swung open, or rather, dissolved into a shimmering portal. On the other side stood a man in a long, flowing cloak made entirely of shifting constellations. His face was half hidden by the brim of a wide, shadowy hat, but what I could see of it didn't look human. His skin shimmered like liquid metal, and his eyes glowed faintly, like embers beneath ash. Ah, good, he said, his voice deep and resonant. You're awake. We don't have much time. Who are you? I asked, backing away. Call me Solace, he said with a slight bow. I'm here to guide you through the shuffle. The coffee table was already doing that, I said, gesturing toward it. Solace glanced at the table, his expression unreadable. That thing? Please. It's barely a C-tier guide. Excuse me, the coffee table snapped, its legs bristling indignantly. I have been in this household for years. I know every crumb, every spill, every... Enough, Solace said, snapping his fingers. The table let out an indignant squeak and skittered into the corner, muttering to itself. Okay, seriously, I said, turning back to Solace. What's going on? Why is my furniture alive? Why is the floor mad at me? And why does the sky look like it's been hit by a blender? The shuffle, he said simply. Realms collide, rules dissolve, and the boundaries of existence blur. It happens every 1,000 years or so. A cosmic reset. You've been chosen as this cycle's anchor. Anchor? The one who stabilizes the chaos, he said. Without an anchor, the shuffle could spiral out of control, unraveling not just your reality, but every reality it touches. No pressure, huh? I said, running a hand through my hair. What do I have to do? Survive, he said, as if it were the easiest thing in the world. Great. And how do I do that? Before he could answer, the window shattered. Except it didn't break outward like glass. It imploded, sucking the light and air out of the room, and through the jagged void stepped a creature I couldn't fully comprehend. It had too many limbs, too many eyes, and its form shifted constantly, as though reality itself couldn't decide what it was supposed to look like. Ah, Solace said calmly, a reality bleed. That's new. New. I yelped, backing away. It's fine, he said, pulling a long, curved blade from somewhere within his cloak. The blade shimmered with an inner light, casting fractured rainbows across the walls. Stay behind me. The creature let out a sound that wasn't quite a roar, but more like the grinding of tectonic plates. Its limbs lashed out, warping the space around it, and the room twisted like a funhouse mirror. Solace moved faster than I thought possible, slicing through one of the creature's limbs with a single, precise strike. The severed appendage dissolved into a cascade of shimmering dust, and the creature let out another unearthly sound, retreating slightly. You're doing great, the coffee table shouted from its corner. Not helping. I snapped. Solace struck again, driving the creature back toward the void it had come through. With one final swing, he severed its connection to our reality entirely, and the void snapped shut with a sound like a thunderclap. Well, he said, sheathing his blade. That was invigorating. Invigorating? I said, clutching my chest. I almost died. But you didn't, he pointed out. And that's what matters. Now, come. There's much to do, and time is short. As the shimmering portal reopened, I took one last look at my chaotic, upside-down room. The coffee table gave me a cheery wave with one of its spindly legs, and I sighed. So here's my question. If your world suddenly became a chaotic mashup of dimensions, and you were chosen as the anchor, how do you think you'd handle it? And more importantly, how long would you last before the floor decided to eat you? Here's how I ended up locked in a stranger's bathroom, covered in glitter, holding a pineapple and questioning every choice that had led me to that moment. It started with a scavenger hunt. Not your average backyard, find the plastic eggs kind of scavenger hunt. No, this was a citywide event called the Midnight Dash, organized by a group of eccentric people who clearly had too much time on their hands. My friend Mia heard about it through a Facebook group and begged me to join her team. It'll be fun, she said. A little adventure. A little mystery. What she didn't say was, it'll ruin your dignity, cover you in glitter, and potentially land you in someone's bathroom at 2 a.m. I should have known this was a mistake when the event email included a waiver with the phrase, mild risk of injury or humiliation. But I signed it anyway, because who reads waivers, right? The rules were simple, or so we thought. Teams of 4 were given a list of absurd items to collect, bizarre challenges to complete, and riddles to solve, all within a 6-hour time limit. The list ranged from the mildly inconvenient, take a photo with a live chicken, to the outright ridiculous, acquire a stranger's sock. And the grand prize? A trophy shaped like a raccoon holding a key, plus bragging rights forever. Totally worth it, obviously. Our team consisted of me, Mia, her overly enthusiastic cousin Jake, and a quiet guy named Ian whom Mia had invited because he had a car and a mysterious vibe. Ian didn't say much, but he nodded solemnly when Mia explained the plan, so we figured he was in. The chaos began immediately. Our first clue led us to a bowling alley, where we had to convince the manager to let us roll a frame while blindfolded. That took an hour because Jake refused to ask politely and instead kept trying to negotiate by offering his half-eaten bag of Doritos. Once we finally completed the challenge, we ran out of the bowling alley only to realize that one of the items on the scavenger list was a traffic cone. Ian, ever the silent problem solver, pulled one out of his trunk. No explanation, just already had one. We didn't ask questions. Things escalated from there. We sprinted through a supermarket searching for a pineapple, another item on the list, accidentally knocked over a display of canned soup, and got yelled at by an employee who was definitely not paid enough to deal with us. We recruited a random guy named Tim at a gas station to help us take a group selfie in front of a neon sign shaped like a flamingo. Tim offered us his sock in exchange for a ride home, which we politely declined. Jake, however, insisted we needed the sock 4 points. So now we had Tim's sock, and Tim had an awkward story for his friends. By midnight, we were neck-deep in the weirdness. We'd managed to borrow a wig from a guy in a bar, don't ask, and gotten glitter dumped on us during a surprise bonus challenge that involved dancing to a remix of Cotton Eye Joe on a sidewalk. We smelled like sweat, cheap beer, and regret. But we were winning. At least, we thought we were. The final clue was the kicker. It was a riddle. In a room of mirrors, the door hides the prize. Find the golden key before the clock strikes twice. Jake stared at it like it was written in ancient Greek, but Ian, the enigma that he was, immediately said, "A house party." "What?" I asked. "The answer's a house party," Ian replied, as if this was common knowledge. He pulled out his phone and started Googling local events. Within minutes, we were on our way to a house in a neighborhood none of us recognized. The house was already vibrating with loud music and questionable decisions. It was one of those parties where people you've never met act like you're their long-lost best friend. So we blended in easily. We split up to search for the room of mirrors, and that's how I ended up in the bathroom. It wasn't my first choice, but I figured, hey, bathrooms have mirrors, right? Except the door locked behind me as soon as I stepped inside, which was already alarming. Then I noticed the glitter-covered floor, the faint smell of lavender, and the pineapple someone had left on the sink. In the corner, a guy in a pirate costume was snoring softly in the bathtub. He woke up when I accidentally kicked over a bottle of bubble bath, looked at me blearily, and said, "You here for the key?" "Yes," I said, "because what else do you say to a bathtub pirate?" He pointed to the pineapple. "It's in there." Now, there are moments in life when you pause to reflect on the absurdity of your existence. This was one of those moments. But I didn't have time to think about how strange it was that I was digging through a pineapple in a stranger's bathroom while a guy in a pirate costume watched. Sure enough, taped to the inside of the pineapple was a small, glittery key. When I unlocked the bathroom door, my team was waiting in the hallway. "Did you find it?" Mia asked breathlessly. I held up the key. It was in a pineapple. "Of course it was," Jake muttered, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. We raced back to the meeting point, where the organizers were waiting with the raccoon trophy. We were the first team to arrive, sticky with pineapple juice and glitter, but victorious. The prize? A $50 gift card to a diner and the raccoon trophy, which now sits proudly on my bookshelf. So, have you ever found yourself in a situation so surreal that you couldn't explain it even if you tried? Or have you ever followed a wild idea just to see where it would take you? Because I promise, sometimes the weirdest nights are the ones that stick with you forever. The day I discovered I was technically a pirate started with a very boring sandwich. I was at my office desk, eating said sandwich, a dry turkey and Swiss on wheat, and staring at an even drier spreadsheet when my phone buzzed with an email. The subject line read, "Your package has been delivered." The thing is, I hadn't ordered anything. Curious, I opened the email, which only had two things: a cryptic tracking number and an address. The address wasn't mine. It was for a storage unit on the edge of town. Now, I know what you're thinking. Clearly, you delete the email and go back to your very dull sandwich. But let's be real, I was desperate for a distraction. So, I Googled the storage unit, called in sick for the afternoon to an entirely unsympathetic boss, and decided to investigate. What's life without a little mystery, right? The storage facility looked exactly how you'd imagine. Gray, boxy, and slightly depressing, like a prison for people's forgotten junk. I showed the front desk lady the tracking number, and she squinted at it before pointing me toward Unit 34B. "We don't usually deliver to storage units," she said, more to herself than me. Weird. Weird was right. I walked over, unlocked the unit, using a key that had somehow come in the mail weeks ago. I'd completely forgotten about it until that moment, and rolled up the door. Inside was a canoe. Just a canoe. Not a new one, either. This thing looked like it had been through several wars and a midlife crisis. The wood was scratched, the paint was peeling, and one of the oars had a suspicious bite mark, as if it had been gnawed on by a very determined raccoon. At this point, most people would have walked away. But there was something about the canoe that felt oddly deliberate, like it was meant to be here, meant to be found. Plus, there was a small metal plaque bolted to the side with the words "Property of Captain Marlowe" engraved on it. I don't know why, but that sent a tiny thrill up my spine. Captain Marlowe? Who the hell was that? As I stood there, trying to decide what to do, I noticed something else. A folded piece of paper stuck under the oar. I pulled it out and unfolded it to reveal a map. An actual, honest-to-God treasure map. The paper was yellowed, with jagged edges like it had been torn out of a pirate's diary. The map wasn't especially detailed, just a coastline, an X, and a set of coordinates scrawled in the corner. But it felt real enough to make my stomach do a little flip. My boring sandwich and spreadsheets were officially a distant memory. That's how I ended up towing a beat-up canoe to the nearest beach and paddling out into the ocean like a lunatic. Now, let me clarify. I am not a water person. I'm not even a mildly damp person. My experience with boats was limited to overpriced paddleboat rentals at city parks. But something about this map, this ridiculous canoe, made me forget all that. It felt like a dare from the universe, and I wasn't about to chicken out. The water was calm at first, and the sky was a postcard-perfect shade of blue. I paddled toward the coordinates, checking my phone's GPS like a proper 21st century explorer. After about an hour, I spotted something sticking out of the water ahead. A small, weathered buoy bobbing gently in the waves. I reached it, tied the canoe to the buoy with a frayed rope that had been sitting in the bottom of the boat, and looked around. Nothing. Just endless ocean. I was about to chalk it up to a wild goose chase when I saw it. Just beneath the surface, glinting in the sunlight. A chest. An actual chest. Wooden, barnacle-covered, and sitting at the bottom of the ocean like it was straight out of a pirate movie. My heart leapt into my throat. I had no scuba gear, no plan, just an overwhelming urge to get that thing out of the water. I don't know how I did it. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe it was dumb luck. But somehow, after what felt like an eternity of flailing and cursing, I managed to haul the chest onto the canoe. It wasn't big, about the size of a cooler, but it was heavy. My arms felt like jello by the time I was done, but I didn't care. I'd done it. I'd found treasure. I pried the chest open with the oar, fully expecting to find gold coins or jewels, or maybe even a cursed skeleton hand. But what I found instead was socks. Yes, socks. They were neatly folded, surprisingly dry, and looked brand new, despite the chest's ancient exterior. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke, but then I noticed something else. Underneath the socks was a leather-bound journal. I flipped it open, and the first page read, "To whoever finds this, congratulations. You're a pirate now. Use it wisely." The rest of the journal was filled with strange notes, diagrams of sailing routes, and what appeared to be a list of names. Some were crossed out, others circled, and all of it was written in the same neat, looping handwriting. At the very back of the journal was a single, cryptic sentence. "The socks are the key." I stared at the socks. They stared back. I felt like I'd been handed the setup to a joke without the punchline. By the time I paddled back to shore, the sun was setting, and my brain was spinning. Who was Captain Marlowe? Why did they leave socks in a chest in the middle of the ocean? And, most importantly, what did it mean to be a pirate in 2024? I still have the chest. It's sitting in my living room, a reminder of the strangest day of my life. I've been wearing the socks because, honestly, why not? And every time I put them on, I feel a little sharper, braver, like the world is just a little less predictable than it used to be. So yeah, I'm a pirate now, or something like it. What about you? Ever stumble into something so bizarre it feels like you've been recruited into a story bigger than yourself? Or is it just me, following treasure maps and taking life advice from socks? I didn't plan to adopt a cactus. It just sort of happened. One moment, I was in a big box store trying to decide between two equally overpriced laundry detergents, and the next, I was standing in the garden section, staring at a little cactus with a bright pink flower glued to the top of it. That's right, glued. They didn't even try to hide the adhesive. It was a ridiculous, Frankensteinian little thing, but for some reason, I couldn't walk away from it. It had this scrappy energy, like it was daring me to bring it home. So I did. I named it Carl. Now, here's the thing about Carl. He wasn't exactly high maintenance. He was the type of houseplant you could accidentally neglect for weeks and still find smugly thriving in the same corner where you left him. But something about him felt oddly alive, like he had a personality, and not just because of the absurdly fake flower. Sometimes I'd walk by and swear he was judging me, like when I ate an entire box of cookies instead of cooking dinner. Other times, he seemed to cheer me on, particularly when I managed to keep another plant alive for more than a month. I don't know why, but Carl felt significant, like he had come into my life for a reason. One night, I was sitting on the couch, staring at Carl while scrolling through my phone, when it hit me how weird it is that plants have become a cornerstone of modern life. Not survival plants, like corn or potatoes, but decorative plants. We're all just living with these green roommates, pretending they're low-stakes pets or tiny, judgmental friends. Every time I go on social media, I see people showing off their fiddle leaf figs or propagating pothos vines like they're preparing for a plant-based apocalypse. We've collectively decided that houseplants are both a personality trait and a subtle competition. And here I was, staring at Carl, who looked more like an awkward porcupine than a botanical showstopper. I wondered if this obsession with plants was humanity's way of fighting back against the digital age. Think about it. We spend half our lives staring at screens, so maybe the greenery is an attempt to reconnect with something real, something alive. Or maybe we're just bored and need something to post about between vacation photos. Either way, Carl didn't seem to care. He just sat there, doing his cactus thing, completely indifferent to my existential musings. That night, I had the strangest dream. I was wandering through a desert at sunset, and in the distance, I saw a giant cactus, Carl, but supersized, towering over the sand like a spiky monument. His glued-on flower had transformed into a crown, and his vibe was very much king of the desert. When I approached, he spoke, because of course he did. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly, like the narrator of a nature documentary. I didn't have an answer, because what do you say to a talking cactus? Instead, I stood there, the desert wind swirling around me, until he leaned down, somehow, and said, "Water what matters." Then I woke up. Water what matters? What kind of cryptic self-help nonsense was that? I couldn't stop thinking about it. Over the next few days, I found myself analyzing the dream like it was some kind of prophetic vision. Was Carl telling me to focus on what's important? To take better care of my relationships? Or maybe it was just my brain's way of reminding me to drink more water. Either way, I decided to embrace it. Every time I looked at Carl, I'd think about his strange, dream desert wisdom and ask myself, what actually matters to me? Turns out, it's not always easy to figure that out. Life is full of distractions, work emails, group chats, endless streaming options, and it's easy to lose track of the things that actually make you feel alive. Inspired by Carl's words, or my subconscious, depending on how you look at it, I started making small changes. I called an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. I finally opened that book I'd been meaning to read since 2019. I even started cooking real meals again, which Carl seemed to appreciate, judging by how smug he looked on the windowsill. One day, while watering Carl, because now I was paranoid about neglecting him, I noticed something incredible, a tiny sprout growing from his base. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but no, it was real. Carl had a baby, or maybe a clone. I wasn't sure how cacti reproduction worked, but either way, it felt like a sign. I named the sprout Carlito and immediately Googled how to care for baby cacti, even though I knew Carl would probably handle it himself. That's the thing about cacti, they don't need much, but when you give them even a little attention, they thrive in ways you don't expect. Over time, Carl and Carlito became symbols of something bigger in my life. They reminded me that growth doesn't have to be dramatic or flashy. Sometimes it's just about surviving, about holding on and letting yourself change little by little. And sometimes, it's about taking what you've learned and passing it on, whether to a tiny cactus sprout or to the people around you. One evening, as I sat on the couch with Carl and Carlito in their corner, I realized how much my perspective had shifted since that strange dream. The world felt a little less overwhelming, a little more manageable. Maybe that's the secret of plants. They teach us patience without ever saying a word. They remind us to slow down, to notice the quiet miracles happening all around us. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they even give you cryptic advice in a dream. So now I've got 2 cacti, a slightly healthier outlook on life, and a new favorite mantra, water what matters. It's simple, sure, but it's surprisingly effective. What's the weirdest thing in your life that ended up teaching you something profound? Okay, so it's 1:47 a.m., and I'm sitting cross-legged on my bathroom floor, holding a sponge in one hand and a plunger in the other, soaking wet, while a steady trickle of water runs down the walls. The only light comes from the flickering bulb above the mirror, which adds a certain horror movie ambience to the whole situation. If I squint, I feel like I could pass for the unhinged protagonist in a low-budget indie film titled, "The Night the Pipes Fought Back." How did I get here? Excellent question. It all started about 3 hours earlier when I noticed a slow drip coming from under the bathroom sink. Nothing crazy, just that rhythmic little plink, plink, plink that you tell yourself isn't a big deal, but deep down you know it's the opening act of a plumbing apocalypse. Naturally, I did what any reasonable adult would do. I threw a towel under the sink and decided to ignore it until future me could deal with it. Future me hates present me, by the way. An hour later, the situation escalated. I went to brush my teeth and found water spreading across the bathroom floor like it was auditioning to be the next Great Lake. The towel was soaked, the drip had turned into a full-on leak, and the cabinet under the sink was doing its best impression of the Titanic. I panicked. I Googled how to fix a sink leak with the desperate energy of someone who's never owned a wrench but thinks YouTube tutorials hold the secrets to the universe. Armed with zero experience and a newfound sense of misplaced confidence, I turned off the water valve, step one in every plumbing video ever. Easy enough. Feeling victorious, I grabbed a bucket, crawled under the sink, and started poking around. That's when I saw it. The pipe connection was loose, barely hanging on. I tightened it with my hand and thought, wow, I'm basically a plumber now. But when I turned the water back on, the pipe immediately burst apart with a force so dramatic it could have been scored by Hans Zimmer. Water sprayed everywhere. The ceiling, my face, my soul. I scrambled to turn the valve off again, but by then the bathroom looked like a scene from the Poseidon Adventure. My cat, who'd been watching the whole thing with morbid curiosity, bolted out of the room like, "You're on your own, buddy." That's when the absurdity hit me. There I was, drenched, crouching under a sink at midnight, fighting a battle against a system I clearly did not understand. And for some reason, instead of getting mad, I started laughing. Like, full body, can't breathe. What is my life kind of laughing? Because of course this was happening. Of course, I thought I could outsmart a pipe with sheer optimism. Of course, the universe was like, oh, you want to DIY this? Cool, let's add a little chaos. Once I calmed down, I called my dad. Because isn't that what you're supposed to do when plumbing goes wrong? He answered groggily, and I launched into a breathless explanation of my crisis. His response? A long pause, followed by, why didn't you just call a plumber? A fair question. But at this point, it wasn't just about fixing the sink anymore. It was personal. Me versus the pipes. A battle for dignity, even if I had none left. So, I did what anyone would do in my position. I went back in, I watched another YouTube video, found the plunger, and tried to dislodge any airlocks in the system, which is a fancy way of saying I plunged the sink like I was performing CPR on it. Did it work? Absolutely not. What it did do was make the leak angrier. Water started dripping from the bathroom light fixture, which I'm pretty sure is some kind of illegal in the universe's physics handbook. Which brings us back to now. Me on the floor, soggy and defeated, wondering how I went from tightening a pipe to accidentally creating indoor weather. And yet, weirdly enough, I'm not mad. Because as I sit here, I realize this is one of those moments I'll laugh about later. The kind of thing that becomes a story, the kind you tell at parties when someone asks, "What's the dumbest thing you've ever done?" And isn't that kind of the point? Life isn't just the big moments. It's also the midnight plumbing fails, the absurd little battles that remind you how hilariously imperfect you are. Sure, I'm soaked and tired and maybe a little electrocuted. The light flickered ominously a second ago. But I'm also alive. I'm trying. I'm showing up for this ridiculous, messy thing we call existence, even if I clearly have no idea what I'm doing. The plumber is coming tomorrow morning. Until then, I'll just enjoy the drip 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 soundtrack of my personal disaster and try not to think about the fact that I might have voided my security deposit. Anyway, now I'm curious. What's the most ridiculous problem you've ever tried and failed to solve yourself? Bonus points if it involved water. The elevator doors slid shut, trapping me in a box of gleaming steel and humming silence. The only other occupant was a man standing in the far corner, his posture too relaxed for the late hour. His hands were tucked casually into his pockets, his head tilted slightly as if listening to a melody only he could hear. Something about him felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, but off in a way I couldn't define. I pressed the button for the 15th floor, and the elevator began its ascent, the faint hum of machinery filling the space. The man didn't move, but I could feel his eyes on me, the weight of his gaze unsettling against the sterile backdrop of polished metal and fluorescent light. "Late night?" he asked, his voice smooth and warm, like the first sip of whiskey. I nodded, not meeting his eyes. "Yeah." The numbers above the door ticked up slowly, too slowly, each one taking longer than the last. I could feel the man watching me, his presence filling the elevator like an unspoken question. "Where are you going?" he asked, his tone casual but laced with curiosity. "15th floor," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. His smile widened, a flicker of amusement dancing in his eyes. "Are you sure?" The question made me glance at him, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. His face was ordinary, handsome in a forgettable way, but his eyes were impossibly dark, so deep they seemed to pull at something inside me, a gravitational force I couldn't escape. I looked away quickly, my pulse quickening. "What kind of question is that?" I muttered, trying to sound annoyed but mostly sounding afraid. The elevator jolted suddenly, the lights flickering as it shuddered to a stop. I grabbed the railing, my heart lurching as the hum of the machinery died, leaving us in thick, oppressive silence. "Looks like we're stuck," the man said, his tone light, almost cheerful. He stepped forward, and I pressed myself against the wall, my skin prickling with unease. He leaned casually against the opposite railing, his posture loose but his gaze fixed on me. "Do you know why you're here?" I frowned. "What? I just got in the elevator." "Did you?" he asked, tilting his head slightly, his expression unreadable. I opened my mouth to reply, but something about his tone stopped me. The words didn't come. Instead, I found myself staring at the doors, willing them to open, to let me escape this strange, suffocating moment. "You're not really going to the 15th floor, he said softly, his voice threading through the silence like smoke. "Not yet. What are you talking about?" I snapped, more to shake off the growing sense of dread than out of any real anger. He smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "You're going somewhere else first." Before I could respond, the elevator jolted again, the lights dimming until only a faint glow remained, casting long shadows across the mirrored walls. The air grew heavier, colder, as if the space had expanded into something vast and unknowable. The doors slid open. What lay beyond wasn't the 15th floor. It wasn't any floor. It was a hallway that stretched into darkness, its walls lined with doors that didn't match. Some were ornate, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when I looked at them. Others were plain, cracked wood that seemed to hum faintly, like they were alive. The air smelled of damp earth and something metallic, something sharp. "Go on," the man said, his voice low and coaxing. "You'll find what you're looking for." I turned to him, my chest tight with confusion and fear. "What the hell is this?" His smile faded, replaced by something solemn. "It's the place between. You've been here before, even if you don't remember." "I've never—" "Go," he interrupted, his tone soft but insistent. "There's no going back until you do." I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but my legs were already moving, carrying me out of the elevator and into the hallway. The doors slid shut behind me with a finality that made my stomach drop. The silence here was different. It wasn't empty. It was thick, teeming with something just out of reach, like whispers you couldn't quite hear. The doors lining the hallway seemed to shift as I walked, their edges warping, their surfaces rippling like water. One door stood out, a heavy, black door with a brass handle shaped like an outstretched hand. It pulsed faintly, its surface gleaming as if it were breathing. I stopped in front of it, my hand hovering over the handle. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, weaving together into a single voice that spoke my name. "Who's there?" I whispered, my throat tight. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the door swung open, revealing a room bathed in soft, golden light. It wasn't what I expected. It was familiar. A living room I hadn't seen in years, its walls lined with bookshelves and its floor scattered with mismatched rugs. A couch sat in the center, its cushions worn and faded, and on it sat a woman. She looked up as I stepped inside, her face a mix of shock and relief. It took me a moment to place her, but when I did, the air left my lungs. "Mom." She smiled, the same tired, warm smile I remembered, and suddenly I was 10 years old again, sitting on that couch with a book too big for my hands. "You made it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Tears blurred my vision as I stumbled forward, collapsing onto the couch beside her. She pulled me into an embrace, her touch warm and solid, and for a moment, the world felt whole again. How is this possible? I choked out. You're gone, she finished gently, her hand brushing my hair, but not entirely. I pulled back, staring at her, the questions tumbling over each other in my mind. Where am I? What is this place? She hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the door. It's where you come to find what you've lost, but you can't stay. Why not? Because it's not meant to hold you, she said, her smile fading. And if you stay too long, it will. Before I could respond, the room began to dim, the golden light flickering like a candle in the wind. My mother's face blurred, her voice growing faint. Remember, she whispered, her words barely audible. It's always your choice. The next thing I knew, I was back in the hallway, the black door sealed behind me. The whispers were gone, replaced by the faint hum of the elevator. When the doors opened, the man was waiting, his expression unreadable. Did you find it? He asked. I clutched the memory tightly, my heart aching but steady. I think so. He nodded, stepping aside as the elevator hummed to life. Then you're ready. I didn't ask what he meant. I just stepped inside, the doors closing with a soft hiss, and watched as the numbers climbed steadily toward 15. The day I found the door in my closet, I was looking for my left shoe. It was the kind of morning where everything goes wrong. Alarm too quiet, coffee machine blinking in rebellion, hair refusing to cooperate. I was already running late for work when I kicked a pile of clothes out of the way and saw it. A thin seam carved into the back wall of my closet. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of that. I've lived in this apartment for 3 years, and if there's one thing I know, it's my closet. I pressed my palm against it, expecting wood or drywall, but the surface gave way slightly, like it was breathing. That was the first weird thing. The second was the handle that suddenly appeared. A brass knob so polished I could see my startled reflection in it. I hesitated. I had 10 minutes to get out the door and I knew this was a terrible idea. But when faced with a mysterious door in your own home, the kind that shouldn't exist, how do you just walk away? So I opened it. The door swung inward, and on the other side was a forest. Not the kind of forest you find in real life. No trails, no people jogging with water bottles clipped to their belts. This forest was ancient, a tangle of trees so tall they seemed to hold up the sky. The air was dense with the smell of pine and moss and something sweet, like the ghost of a campfire long extinguished. A thick mist curled low to the ground, swirling around my ankles when I stepped forward. Behind me, I heard my phone buzzing on the nightstand, the world I knew still trying to claim me. I looked back once, just to be sure the door was still there. It was, though it looked different from this side. Older, the brass knob tarnished and pocked with rust. A small wooden sign hung above it, though the letters carved into it were worn and unreadable. I should have turned back. I know that now, but instead, I took another step, and the door creaked shut behind me. I stood there for a long time, listening. The forest was quiet in the way places are quiet when they're watching you. The mist hissed softly as it moved, like it was whispering to itself. Then, somewhere far off, a bell rang. 3 clear, resonant chimes that seemed to hang in the air, vibrating in my bones. I started walking toward the sound, partly because I didn't know what else to do and partly because it felt like I was supposed to. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. The trees didn't just look old, they felt aware. Their branches twisted toward the ground like they were trying to touch me, their leaves rustling even though there was no wind. I saw shapes moving in the mist, small ones like animals, but they were too quick for me to get a proper look. Every now and then, I'd hear something just behind me. A snap of a twig, the soft whoosh of breath, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I kept telling myself it was fine, that this was some elaborate dream brought on by stress or bad takeout. My brain would wake me up eventually, and I'd laugh about how real it all felt. But the air smelled too sharp, the ground was too solid beneath my feet, and my skin felt cold where the mist touched it. Dreams don't get the details right. I found the bell hanging from a tree branch, a massive iron thing covered in creeping vines. There was no rope or mechanism to ring it, but the sound had definitely come from here. As I reached up to touch it, a voice spoke behind me, "You're not supposed to be here yet." I spun around so quickly I nearly tripped. Standing a few feet away was a woman, though I used that word loosely. She looked human at first glance, tall and thin, wrapped in a cloak the color of old blood, but her face was wrong. Her eyes were too large, black and glossy like a beetle's shell, and her skin had the gray, papery texture of something long dead. When she smiled, I saw teeth like needles. I didn't mean to," I stammered, unable to finish the sentence because I didn't know what I hadn't meant to do. She tilted her head, her hair falling in long, dark tangles that seemed to move on their own. "You opened the door," she said simply. "That means you were called." "Called for what?" I asked. Her smile widened. "To choose." The bell above us rang again. 3 deep, resonant notes that made the ground tremble. The woman extended one long, gray hand and pointed behind me. I turned slowly and saw that the forest had changed. The trees now formed 2 distinct paths, one leading left and the other right. Both were shrouded in mist, but I could see glimpses of movement through them. Shapes darting between trees, shadows flickering against the fog. "One path leads forward," the woman said, "and one leads back. You may only choose once." "And if I don't choose?" I asked. She shrugged, the motion unsettlingly fluid. "Then you stay here." "Some do." I didn't like the way she said that. I glanced back at the paths. The one on the left seemed brighter, almost inviting. I could hear faint sounds coming from it. Music, maybe laughter. The path on the right was darker, the mist thicker. Something about it felt heavy, like the air before a storm. "Which one is which?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Her beetle eyes blinked once, slowly. "That is for you to decide." A chill ran through me. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at those 2 paths, my mind racing. The left path was tempting, but it felt too easy, like bait in a trap. The right path, though, there was something about it that tugged at me, a quiet voice whispering, "This is the way." "I don't understand," I said finally. "You will," she replied. I don't know why I chose the right path. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe it was just stubbornness. Some part of me refusing to take the obvious way out. As soon as I stepped onto the path, the mist thickened, swirling around my legs and rising to my chest. I could barely see my own hands in front of me. The ground felt soft, like I was walking on layers of ash. I kept moving, though, even as the shadows in the mist grew larger, closer. At one point, I heard someone whisper my name, softly, right next to my ear. I turned, but there was no one there. I kept walking. The whisper came again, louder this time, and then again, overlapping itself until it became a chorus. My name, over and over, spoken by voices I didn't recognize. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside my head, growing sharper, angrier, until I thought my skull might split open. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The mist parted, and I found myself standing in a clearing. In the center of it was another door. This one was carved from dark wood, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when I looked at them. The brass handle gleamed, polished and bright, and above it hung a sign that read, "Forward." I looked back over my shoulder, but the path was gone. There was only mist and shadow, pressing in around the clearing like a wall. I turned back to the door, my pulse thudding in my ears. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, half expecting it to burn my skin, but it didn't. It was cold and smooth, and when I turned it, the door opened soundlessly. On the other side, there was light, soft and golden, the kind that comes at the end of a storm. I stepped through, and the door closed behind me. I woke up in my bed, tangled in blankets, sunlight streaming through the window. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a reminder that I was already late for work. Everything looked normal, but something felt different. The apartment was too quiet. I got up slowly, my legs unsteady, and glanced at the closet. The door was gone, and on the floor, where the door had been, there was a single brass key. When I was a kid, My dad told me that some things only appear when you're not looking for them, like lost socks, shooting stars, and stray cats. I used to think it was just one of those quirky dad sayings, but I was wrong. It's not just socks and stars. It's doors, too. I discovered the door when I was 11. It was the summer of '98, and my parents had dragged me to visit my great-uncle Earl, who lived in a sprawling, crooked farmhouse that seemed allergic to straight lines. It creaked like a ship at sea and smelled faintly of mothballs and something old, like forgotten time. I hated being there. Uncle Earl wasn't mean, exactly, but he wasn't friendly either. He was quiet, like he didn't quite know what to do with people anymore. Most of that summer, I was left to my own devices, exploring the farmhouse while my parents and Uncle Earl sipped iced tea on the sagging porch. I'd count the cracked floor tiles, avoid the rooms that felt too still, and search for treasures in boxes filled with yellowed newspaper clippings and broken clocks. I knew the house inside out, or so I thought. The door wasn't there the first time I looked. It was in the hallway at the very back of the house, behind a wardrobe that I swear had been flush against the wall for years. I only found it because I knocked one of Uncle Earl's dusty hunting trophies off the wall, some deer antlers, and when I bent down to pick them up, I noticed a sliver of something strange in the wood. Curious, I pushed the wardrobe aside, grunting against its weight. Dust exploded in the air. A century of stillness disturbed, and there it was, a door. It wasn't like any of the other doors in the house. For one thing, it was smaller, barely taller than I was. Its wood was dark and polished, too fine for the farmhouse, and there was something off about it, as if the frame didn't quite match the rest of the wall, like it didn't belong. There was no doorknob, just a small brass keyhole, and when I pressed my ear against it, I swear I heard music. Faint, lilting notes, the kind of tune that makes you think of forests and fairies and forgotten things. The weirdest part? The door was cold. Ice cold. Even in the middle of a sticky southern summer, it felt like touching the side of a freezer. I knew I shouldn't mess with it. If my dad caught me snooping, I'd never hear the end of it. But what's the point of being 11 if you don't do the things you shouldn't? I spent the next 2 days searching for a key. Uncle Earl had boxes of them. Keys to locks that didn't exist anymore. Keys to cabinets no one opened. Skeleton keys with loops and ridges like knotted veins. None of them worked. I almost gave up, but then, on the third morning, I found it. It was in the pantry, hidden at the bottom of a rusted tin of powdered cocoa that expired before I was born. The key was small and made of brass, its surface smooth and cool in my palm. Something told me it was the key before I even tried it. I waited until the afternoon, when the adults were asleep. The door accepted the key with a soft, satisfying click. I hesitated, my heart pounding so hard I felt it in my throat. What was I expecting? Treasure? A secret passageway? A monster? I didn't know. I turned the handle, and the door swung inward. It wasn't a room on the other side. It was a forest. I don't mean a wallpapered room that looked like a forest. I mean a real one. Trees stretched upward into a canopy so thick that the sunlight only dripped through in soft, golden puddles. Moss carpeted the ground, and the air was cool and crisp with the faint smell of rain. Somewhere in the distance, I heard birds calling, though I couldn't see them. I stepped through the door, my sneakers sinking softly into the moss. I turned back to look at the hallway, but the door was gone. Just gone. For a moment, panic bubbled up inside me. I spun around, searching for some sign of where I was, but the forest was vast and endless. Still, I didn't feel scared. Exactly. The air felt friendly, like it had been waiting for me. I walked. I don't know for how long. Time felt different there, slippery and loose. The forest changed as I moved through it. The trees became taller, their bark shimmering like it was dusted with frost, even though it wasn't cold. Mushrooms the size of dinner plates sprouted in clusters, glowing faintly blue. I swear I saw a fox, but its fur was silver, and its eyes were too bright to be anything ordinary. Eventually, I reached a clearing. At the center stood a tree, wider than a house and so ancient it looked like it had been there since the world was made. Its roots twisted into the earth like fingers digging in, and its branches reached out, tangled and vast. There was a girl sitting at the base of the tree. She was about my age, with long dark hair and clothes that looked handmade, like something out of a fairy tale. She was holding something in her lap, a small brass key, and when she looked up at me, she smiled. "You found it," she said. "What?" I asked. "The door," she said. I knew someone would. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Where I was, who she was, how she got there. But the words stuck in my throat. She held out the key to me. "It's your turn now," she said. "For what?" "To keep the door safe." I didn't understand, but I took the key anyway. It felt heavy in my hand, too heavy for something so small. When I looked up again, the girl was gone, and the tree was quiet. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard it, the sound of a door creaking open. When I turned, the door was there, standing by itself in the clearing, its frame glowing faintly in the twilight. I stepped through without thinking, and the next thing I knew, I was back in Uncle Earl's hallway. The door was gone. I tried to find it again, even years later. I searched every hallway, every old house, every forgotten corner, but it was like it had never been there at all. I still have the key, though. It's on a string around my neck, cold and heavy against my skin. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it, but sometimes, when the house is very quiet, I hear it again. That faint, lilting music. I think the door is waiting. I didn't know it was cursed when I bought it. It was just a watch. A simple, vintage pocket watch at a flea market, buried under a pile of dusty knickknacks and old postcards. The seller, an old man with wiry glasses and a crooked smile, told me it was from the 1800s. He didn't seem to care about making a sale, just stared at me with this weird intensity, like he was waiting for me to say something specific. I didn't. I just handed him a 20 and walked away with my cool antique. The watch was beautiful in its own way, though worn from age. The silver case had intricate etchings of vines and flowers, and the face was yellowed but still readable, with elegant Roman numerals. It didn't tick, which didn't surprise me. It probably hadn't worked in decades. I didn't care. I wasn't planning on using it to tell time. It just looked cool, the kind of thing that would sit on a shelf and make me look like I had hobbies more interesting than binging shows I'd already seen. I didn't notice anything strange until the first night. I was brushing my teeth when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic ticking. At first, I thought it was my bathroom fan, but when I turned it off, the ticking continued. It was so soft I could barely hear it, but once I noticed it, I couldn't tune it out. It seemed to be coming from the living room. I followed the sound, toothbrush still in my mouth, and stopped in my tracks when I realized it was coming from the pocket watch. The watch that hadn't worked in years. I stared at it for a long time, watching the hands move in slow, deliberate circles. The logical part of me said, well, maybe it's not broken after all. Maybe it just needed to warm up or something. But the rest of me was deeply unsettled. I didn't remember winding it, and as far as I knew, pocket watches didn't warm up. Still, I shrugged it off. Weird, sure, but not that weird, right? The next morning, the ticking was gone. The watch was silent again, its hands frozen at exactly 3:13. I shook it a little, tapped the face, even Googled how to fix a pocket watch, but nothing worked. I left it on the shelf and tried not to think about it. That night, the ticking came back, louder this time. It woke me up at 3:14 a.m., echoing through the apartment like a metronome in an empty auditorium. When I got up to check it, the hands were moving again. Slowly, steadily, counting out seconds that felt too heavy, too deliberate. I decided to get rid of it. No big deal. People return flea market finds all the time, right? But when I went back to the market the next weekend, the old man wasn't there. His booth was empty, like he'd never existed in the first place. I asked around, but no one seemed to know who I was talking about. One vendor even laughed. "You sure you got it here? We don't really have anyone selling antiques." I left the market feeling uneasy, but I convinced myself I was overthinking it. Maybe I'd just toss the watch in the trash, or leave it on a bus. Whatever. That night, I woke up to the ticking again. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the shelf. It was coming from under my pillow. I froze, every hair on my body standing up. Slowly, I reached under the pillow and pulled it out. The watch was warm to the touch, like it had been lying in the sun all day. The hands were moving faster now, spinning wildly around the face like the gears were coming undone. And then, as I held it, the hands stopped, dead still. 3:15. A second later, the lights in my apartment flickered and went out. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark, clutching the watch like it was the only thing anchoring me to reality. When the lights finally came back on, the watch was cold again, its hands frozen. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I tried to throw it away. I walked to the nearest dumpster, chucked it inside, and practically ran back to my apartment. But when I opened the door, there it was, sitting on the coffee table like it had been waiting for me. That's when I noticed the engraving. I don't know how I'd missed it before. It was so faint, scratched into the inside of the case. For words barely legible, "It's not your time." I don't know why, but those words chilled me to the bone. It felt like a warning, or maybe a threat. Over the next few days, the ticking became constant, always in the background, always just loud enough to drive me insane. No matter where I went, I could hear it. At work, at the grocery store, even in the shower. I started sleeping less and less, afraid of what might happen if the watch decided it was my time. And then, 3 nights ago, everything came to a head. I woke up at 3:15 a.m. to the sound of something far worse than ticking. It was a voice, low, guttural, and speaking a language I didn't recognize. It was coming from the watch. The hands were spinning again, faster and faster, until they became a blur. The room felt impossibly cold, and I could see my breath in the air even though it was the middle of July. And then the voice stopped. The watch went silent. For a moment, I thought it was over, but then I noticed the shadow. It was standing in the corner of my bedroom, tall, impossibly thin, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch beyond the dimensions of the room. Its head tilted unnaturally, like it was studying me, watching. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadow didn't speak. It didn't need to. I knew why it was there. I knew it had come for me. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The room was warm again. The watch was still, and I was left alone, shaking and clutching my blanket like a child. Now, the watch is ticking again, steady as ever, and I don't know what to do. The hands are creeping closer to 3:15, and I'm afraid of what will happen when they get there. If anyone's reading this, please, tell me how to break a curse. Tell me how to stop this thing. Because I'm starting to think that when it says, "It's not your time," it doesn't mean me. It means someone else's. And I think I'm supposed to decide who. The day began with a sound that didn't belong. It was a chime, soft and clear, like a crystal bell being struck in a cavern. I'd been stirring sugar into my coffee, lost in the usual haze of morning thoughts, when it rang out again. Closer this time, and impossibly melodic. It wasn't coming from outside, or my phone, or anywhere I could place. It came from the cupboard. I stared at the cupboard above the sink, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But there it was again, a perfect, silvery note that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. There was no reason to open that cupboard. It was where I kept cereal boxes, half-empty bags of rice, and a jar of honey so crystallized it might as well have been an artifact. Nothing in there could make a sound like that, but I opened it anyway. Inside, wedged between a box of Cheerios and a tin of tea, was a door. A door, small and wooden, no taller than the length of my forearm, with a brass handle shaped like an acorn. It hadn't been there yesterday, or any of the days before that. I touched the surface, running my fingers over the wood grain, and the chime sounded again, coming from behind the door this time, like it was inviting me in. I don't know how long I stood there, but at some point, I did the only thing that made sense. I opened it. The door didn't lead to the inside of my cupboard. It led to a forest so dense and green it made my eyes ache, as though the color had been turned up too high. The ground was carpeted with soft moss, and the air buzzed faintly, as if it were alive with whispered conversations. Shafts of light poured down through towering trees, and the scent of something sweet, clover, maybe, filled my nose. I turned around. The cupboard door was still there, hovering like an afterthought in the middle of this impossibly vast forest. I could see my kitchen through it, my coffee cup still steaming on the counter. But when I stepped forward, The door shut softly, sealing itself into the base of a tree. I stood there, barefoot on the moss, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I was in another place entirely, and as strange as it sounds, it didn't feel wrong. It felt like I'd been expected. "About time," said a voice behind me. I spun around so quickly I nearly tripped. Sitting cross-legged on a tree stump was a woman wearing a jacket made entirely of stitched-together leaves. Her hair was braided with small white flowers, and she held what looked like a tiny, golden chime between her fingers. "Where am I?" I asked, still catching my breath. "The threshold," she replied, as though that explained everything. "Most people miss it when it calls, you know? They're too busy being busy." She studied me with an amused tilt of her head. "But you heard it, and you opened the door. Who are you?" "I'm a guide," she said, standing up, "for travelers like you, ones who wander in and don't know where they're headed yet." "I think there's been a mistake," I stammered. "I'm not a traveler. I'm just a guy who opened the wrong cupboard." She laughed, a bright, musical sound that somehow made the trees quiver. "That's how it always starts. Come on, you'll need this." She tossed the golden chime toward me. I caught it awkwardly, surprised to find it was warm to the touch. "What is this for?" "To keep the path open. You wouldn't want to lose your way, would you?" I frowned, turning the chime over in my hands. It looked delicate, but when I shook it, no sound came out. "What path?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and started walking, her leaf-covered jacket blending into the forest so well I nearly lost sight of her. "You can stay here if you like," she called over her shoulder. "But eventually, you'll get hungry, and thirsty, and curious." She wasn't wrong. I followed her. The forest grew stranger the deeper we walked. The trees stretched taller, their trunks spiraling into shapes that made no architectural sense. Once, I swore I saw a doorframe embedded in the branches, glowing faintly like it was waiting for someone to knock. At one point, a fox with 6 tails trotted past us, balancing a teacup perfectly on its head. The woman didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't care. "What is this place?" I asked. "It's between," she replied. "Not quite here, not quite there. A space for stories that haven't been told yet." "Stories?" She glanced back at me, her eyes glinting. "Everyone who steps through the door has one. Some are just better at hiding theirs than others." We stopped eventually in a clearing, where a pool of water sat as still as glass. In its center, a tree rose straight out of the water, its bark shimmering with streaks of silver. The woman gestured to the pool. "Take a look." I stepped to the edge and peered in. At first, I saw nothing but my own reflection. But then the water rippled, and a vision unfolded. I saw myself walking through cities I didn't recognize, under skies that had 2 suns or none at all. I saw versions of me sitting by fires, holding strange objects, laughing with people I'd never met. And somewhere, at the very edge of it all, I saw a door. The door, the one from my cupboard. "What is this?" I whispered. "Possibility," she replied. "The paths you might walk, the people you might become." "And what happens if I go back?" Her smile faded, and her voice grew soft. "Then you go back to your cereal and your cupboards and your quiet, ordinary life. The door doesn't open twice." The chime in my hand buzzed faintly, like a tiny heart beating against my palm. I thought about the comfort of my apartment, of my warm bed and the safety of routine. But then I thought about this place. The foxes with teacups, the impossible trees, the glimpses of something more. "What happens if I stay?" I asked. Her smile returned, wide and wild. "Then you find out." I looked back at the pool, at the shifting versions of myself. Then I looked at her. "Let's go," I said. Her grin deepened. She snapped her fingers, and the forest seemed to exhale, as if the world had been holding its breath for my answer. "Good choice," she said, and the chime in my hand rang, loud and clear, as the path ahead of me opened.